All right. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Peace be to all. This is JBrancatella, aka the Muslim metaphysician. I haven't done a live stream in quite a while because I've been very busy with my book. But I'm here today with Greg Stafford. How are you doing, Greg?
Doing very well, Jay. Good to see you. Glad to be back on your show. 2 point.
Likewise.
Yeah.
So, for people who don't know, Greg and I have done a couple shows before, somewhat related to the topic that we'll be discussing today. For people who don't know or can't read or comprehend too well, the stream is pretty obvious what we're going to be doing today. As you can see, the title of the video is Responding to Sam Shamoun's Lies on Ignatius with Greg Stafford. So I'm here with Greg. He has, a very particular interest regarding these subjects, and I do respect his opinion. So I'm here to mostly facilitate towards him, because if you guys wanted to hear all from me, then I would have just done this myself. Christian, so I don't want people to continuously be, asking throughout the stream. Greg is a Christian. I'll let him say a little bit more about himself here in just a second. But he's our guest, so please respect him. You can ask questions if you'd like in the chat, but mostly it's going to be Greg and I having a conversation. And I don't think it's too harsh to say Sam Shamoun's lies, because I think that he is extremely dishonest. It's not just that he's ignorant, although he's ignorant as well, but he in my mind, and Greg can, say what he'd like about that, but I think he is to a certain degree dishonest. So before we get started on the topic, Greg, maybe because it's been a while, and also, I don't know, maybe there are other people viewing that haven't viewed our streams in the past. If you want to just briefly introduce yourself, explain a little bit about your background, who you are, the fact that you're a Christian, but you're not like these Trinitarians, maybe a little bit about what your distinctive view is.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And it's excuse me. Make sure I'm ready to talk. I don't do streams that often, but once I get going, things kind of open up. Either way, I appreciate you having me here to discuss it. It's a very important topic. So people know me mostly from the Trinity or from being associated with the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, Jehovah's Witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
I was raised as one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and I was baptized after high school in 1990. But for several years, from my sophomore year at least, and part of my freshman year in high school, I became very involved. My family got very involved, and I had different Watchtower people take a special interest in me and spend a lot of time with me. Once I got interested, I started learning more, getting more active and talking to people. And out here in California, where I live, Southern California, we have a lot of different Trinitarian groups from all the different major religious denominations, Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant. We also have a lot of Mormons, and we have a lot of Muslims. But in my early days, I dealt with a lot of different Trinitarians, mostly from the Calvary Chapel and evangelical persuasions, right? The born again Christians. There was a big movement from in the 90s, especially, and in the early 2000s. Sam was a big part of this, Sam Shamoun, in the late 80s or early 90s, right around where I was. We were also very engaged on forums like AOL and through email, early online forums where Dr. White was also very involved, a lot of early apologists, spent a lot of time, as well as in direct contact. I spent whole days, multiple days, face-to-face with people who are well-known today, going over a lot of these different things. Now, they've changed a lot, as I have. I'm no longer with the Watchtower Society, so I don't accept their doctrines about prophecy, special appointment, and various other things. However, my early days with Watchtower did involve such an extent of ministry that I became involved in debates with people like Dr. White, Robert F. Jr., people who were and who are still today very involved in Trinitarian and Christian apologetics and scholarship. So because I was so involved, they took notice of me, gave me the offers to debate, and I accepted. This wasn't something Watchtower people were encouraged or supposed to do, but I did it anyway because I was already doing all these things. And if someone didn't do it, well, then what's the point of doing it in the first place? So I stood up and did it. And I also wrote a book, Jehovah's Witnesses Defended, that has gone through several editions, which beyond the second edition focused primarily on theology, Christology, salvation, and beliefs not so specific to the Watchtower, like prophetic applications and appointments. Although it still crosses over and relates to things like the New World Translation. So translation issues were and still are a very big thing. I got very involved with people like Dr. Daniel B. Wallace of Dallas Theological Seminary, corresponded and spoke with verbally over Sharp's Rule, also wrote significantly about that subject, and I believe still today have provided the most comprehensive non-Trinitarian evaluation of that rule, as well as my own rule, competing with it, that really takes the rule to its furthest extent, right? Because Sharp's rule essentially is a rule based on a specific syntax ultimately, but with a lot of different qualifications because of the different things that are required in interpretation, not just translation. However, when they get to texts like Titus 2:13, that no longer matters. And my rule, the sharpest rule, says that has to matter the whole way. So when you have a special noun, whether it's God, Christ, or a proper name, which they recognize is significant enough to break their preferred construction, like Jesus, which is in Titus 2:13. So there are unique elements associated with some of the Christologically significant texts related to Sharp's rule that I got into further than most, especially since for a long time, Winstanley at least, and Wallace took notice of that. So these things then kind of gave me a little bit more notoriety and reference in texts, like his dissertation on published dissertation on Sharp's rule. But then I left Watchtower, and that created a separation and a period of transition where I maintain my faith. I still believe as a Christian, so I believe in three things above all else: one God the Father, no Trinity. I believe in Jesus as the Messiah, sent forth Savior, and I believe that we should treat each other as we want to be treated. Golden rule. Everything else is still important, but because of the way Christianity has developed and fragmented, we no longer have an efficient way to come together on so many things. Those three I just mentioned are what the Bible in the New Testament says will give you life. So I focus on that, and I try to give people freedom so they can decide what else they want to do, answer to the master. However, I still deal with people like Sam and others on a high profile level because the Trinity is very important, right? It's like the biggest thing in Christendom and a big difference between non-Christian groups, or depends on how you see Muslims, because they speak a lot about Jesus and believe in him, but just not in the same way that Christians do. So it has to be qualified or discussed. Nevertheless, the Trinity is a big issue. So because of my history, I'm still a big part of it. I've done a lot of research, not just on the New Testament and the biblical books, on the apostolic and church fathers, quote unquote, and early Christian writers and other ancient writers. So that's why I'm relevant in these discussions, and I'm happy to discuss Ignatius further. And I've prepared some subjects we can discuss. But anything you want to talk about with respect to Ignatius, anything Sam has said, anything any of these online personalities have said about Ignatius or want to discuss, I'm happy to do so.
And where can people, obviously we'll plug it again at the end of the show, but where, if people want to get more information about you or your work, where can people find you?
Thank you. So you have my YouTube channel, CWJahTube, but also my website, cwjah.org. And there you just kind of get a basic summary of our views, which I summarized in large part, how we go about determining which books of the Bible we accept and how we approach things like that. So we're not quite the same as Protestants, but similar. We go with the best available evidence, right? What does the truth show? And I do believe that effectively leads us to what we have of the New Testament writings, the best available, which are effectively in most canons. But I don't believe that it's limited to that, and I don't believe they're perfect. but it's what we have, and enough to establish the three things I mentioned earlier. So those would be the places: cwjaw.org and my YouTube channel, cwjawtube.
Okay, great. So I'll make sure that's in the description, because I neglected to put that in the description of the video, but it should be there for people who watch this later, who are not watching it live. You can check in the description and you'll find a link to Greg's website and YouTube channel. Okay, so jumping kind of straight into this, the reason why, and I'll let Greg speak more about this if he'd like. The reason why we are focusing on, mentioning Sam Shamoun in this regard is not because we want to give him popularity for no reason or anything like that. Unfortunately, whether we like it or not, he has some level of popularity that he's developed over many years, a few decades now. And many of these pop Christian apologists who are coming out now, like Avery God Logic and, a bunch of these different figures, they look up to Sam. They borrow from his material, his articles, his videos, and some of them literally copy and paste whatever he says, almost as if he is their idol, and that he's their God. I mean, obviously they won't say it like that, but I don't know what it is really that they're so captivated by Sam to a certain degree. And a lot of them just borrow from his material, right? So that's one of the reasons why we're dealing with Sam specifically and mentioning him. And secondly, he constantly has been lying about the church fathers. Now, Greg and I, as we'll see, it's not like we have this strange love for Ignatius, that we agree with him on everything and that we want to protect him from Sam's lies and things like that. No, we have our own strong disagreements with Ignatius, but we're just simply saying, hey, dude, he's not supporting your paganism. He is not, at least on this specific issue. Ignatius is not a Nicene Trinitarian. He does not have the same beliefs that would later be formed, I would argue, and I argue for in my book, in the 4th century and onwards. And so when Sam and some of these Christian apologists are going around, quite frankly, as I said, Sam, I think, is a special case. I don't think he's completely ignorant. I think he is ignorant, and we're here to point out some of his errors. But I think that he also suffers from dishonesty and just straight up lying half the time. And so because of that, we're here to point out his lies, specifically on Ignatius. This is a text from Ignatius that I have. This just contains his letters. I've mainly used this text, but there's a lot to say about the textual traditions and transmission of Ignatius's letters, and we'll get into those things. But yeah, that's just kind of an intro to why we're talking about this. And Sam specifically has, I don't know, a unique love fest of trying to shoehorn in this pagan Trinitarian idea that comes several centuries after Christ, and hoisting this on to the early church fathers like Ignatius, like Justin Martyr, who we dealt with last time for people who recall, and Eusebius lately, which we'll maybe get into. I'll mention a couple things on later on. And so it's because they have this idea of apostolic succession, where they think, oh, Ignatius comes in the succession of the apostles, and he's a disciple of the writer of the Gospel of John. And so he must have the same beliefs as the apostles, and they have this idea of this unbroken chain of transmission. And I don't grant that, but for the sake of argument, if we do grant that, then yeah, these are important figures to these proto-Orthodox or pagans like Sam Shamoun. And therefore they try to force their beliefs, which come several centuries later, onto people like Ignatius. So people need to understand, I'm not sort of preaching to Greg here, but I'm trying to explain to the audience the importance of why these people like Sam Shamoun feel that it's so important to force their later beliefs onto these earlier figures, because they argue that they're actually getting their beliefs from the apostles or the students of the apostles, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of where this is all coming from, and I hope that people understand why we are addressing this topic and why I think it's extremely important. Now, before we go any further, because I should stop talking, I want to kind of pass this off to you, Greg. For people who don't know, and I have the document here for people who don't know, Greg and I have been corresponding on email, and he set up, nicely so, a document for us to kind of go through some texts, some things about the textual transmission and the different traditions of Ignatius's writings. I could read that, but maybe you would want to kind of summarize it, because Ignatius is a special case, I would say. In some ways, he's an easy church father to deal with, because I think some of his beliefs straightforwardly disagree with later Trinitarianism. But in other words, he's one of the most difficult to deal with, because you have to deal with these issues regarding different transmissions of the text and so on and so forth. Somebody like, I'm just grabbing a book here. Somebody like Irenaeus, on the other hand, this is on his work on the apostolic preaching. Not to say that there's no transmission issues, but it's not, the same case that we have with somebody like Ignatius. So maybe from a kind of general perspective, and then we can kind of zoom in, Greg. What are some of the issues that modern scholarship are speaking about when it comes to Ignatius and his letters? How many letters do we have that they claim are authentic from him, and what's this deal with the different recensions and different traditions of the text?
Okay, and feel free. It's always good to hear you, Jake. You're very dialed in. And so let me go ahead and summarize the issues related to the manuscript history and some of the complicating features of the letters of Ignatius, starting with what you just asked. Maybe when we get to the actual selections from his writings, if you want to bring that up, or I could read, but they can also be presented. Either way, we'll summarize this part now. Mm-hmm. So there is up to, in the full tradition of Ignatius, including the mostly spurious letters, up to 17. There are considered to be 7 what are today called the middle recension, mm-hmm. that are the most reliable and that are a part of the Greek and Latin and other language traditions. Mm-hmm. It used to be called the short recension before the Syriac texts were discovered in the 19th century by William Curiton. There are 3 Syriac texts that then became the short recension, moving the 7 letters of the best Greek tradition to the middle. And then the most spurious letters of all traditions, considered the longer letters, that's what they're considered, the long recension. So the middle ascension is your best Greek represented tradition today in the scholarly community. And I think overall, though, even within that tradition, right, there's a lot of disagreement, and not just speculative, right? We have massive interpolation of really all of these letters, except for probably the letter to the Romans. Mm-hmm. That's a special letter in terms of its transmission, separate from the other letters, even the other letters of the middle recension. Okay, so the letter of the Romans is kind of considered the best represented letter, but it's not fully dated. And it itself belongs to a tradition that, as I'm going to explain in a moment, contradicts itself. Okay, even within the shared tradition of having the same letters. So, for example, the Syriac tradition, discovered by Curiton, essentially, there are other fragments. But as I said, three main texts are the short Syriac tradition. Those texts are dated from the 6th, 7th, and 9th centuries. In those Syriac texts, the scribe says these are the only three authentic or genuine letters of Ignatius. Now, so that's your short recension that we're going to review the key text from at the very end of the show. But it comes up also with Sam, because people like Sam get confused, and in some part rightly, right? Sometimes people make mistakes. Sometimes the literature is confusing. Sometimes you're just not up to date with things enough to speak on them, like Sam. So he'll often confuse people, but I think overall, he's essentially just looking for texts that relate to things he can promote. He's not dialed into this textual tradition in the ways you would have to be to fully understand divergent readings and different readings from the different traditions, and whether or not any of these are really viable representations of Ignatius, the real person, around the end of the 1st and beginning of the 2nd century. So he's not capable of that. He can read, he can kind of get capable. He's not actively managing that level of understanding. So when you read or watch him, he's strictly looking for what's middle recension, what's short Syriac recension. Okay, and so while those are probably the two best places to, in general, go, the fact is the long tradition is not nothing. We have pretty good Latin representation, and we also have other language representation that contain both the middle, what is today the middle, and the longer recensions. And so that Latin tradition of the long recension is dated to the 4th century, even though our actual texts of long and middle recension versions of Ignatius date from around the 10th and following centuries. That's the same with the Syriac. So I mentioned the Syriac texts, the three primary Syriac texts of the short recension are from the 6th to the 9th century. But you'll either hear people only refer to the earliest date, 6th, or they'll refer to when they are believed to have been written. So often we have cases where, like with the New Testament, right? We have letters, texts that are 100 or more years after they are believed to have been written, more credible than Ignatius, but they're, by comparison, we're saying they were written earlier, even though we don't have those earlier written documents. So it's even more so the case with people like Ignatius and others that we're saying in their varying traditions. We have texts dated from the 10th century in Latin, but they're from the 4th century controversy, when all of these additional readings likely would have been done to combat these different heresies. And often, especially in Trinitarian circles, they're discounted entirely in terms of legitimacy, even though throughout the entire 4th century, we had nothing but controversy raging, and thereafter, but certainly the 4th century, right, where we had bishops being deposed, we had people being exiled, we had emperors changing their religion and changing who was in power, who was in control of the churches. We had Athanasius going from the early part of the 4th century saying he doesn't have any of the New Testament writings, and good luck finding them. And he doesn't even have the writings of the earlier followers he's using to tell everybody these things, to collecting a canon in the mid to later part of the 4th century that is totally different in significant ways. Well, at least, in terms of the New Testament, that's a little more complicated. But in terms of the actual text material we use, right? So think of Origen. We hardly have anything of Origen. Some material from the late 4th century again. They excommunicated him, destroyed all his books. We have almost nothing of the massive hexapla, right? So if they're so concerned with the text, so concerned with preserving the text, why are they destroying the text so that we can barely figure out who is who and what they taught, and which tradition to believe. Setting aside Origen for now, getting back to Ignatius, right? So this Syriac tradition says,
Greg, can I just say one thing quickly there? Just very quickly about Origen, specifically in the 4th century, you had this controversy where a figure named Rufinus, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, actually explicitly admits to altering Origen's text. In the preface of his translation into Latin from the Greek text of Origen, he explicitly says, and he claims that he's editing it because others tampered with Origen's text at that time and inserted things in there that were heretical, when in actual fact, no, those were just Origen's beliefs. And Rufinus is admitting to editing the text to remove them. In the preface of his translation to Latin, he explicitly admits this, right? So this is not, I just want to say this, these are not like conspiracy theories that Greg and I are coming up with. Sometimes these people actually admit what they're doing, right? And there were this 4th century controversies of these different heresies battling each other. And so people are actually altering the texts in one way or another to try to make them fit with this later theology that these earlier church fathers, who they, give this fake piety to and sense of belonging that they want to fit in line with them, didn't actually hold their views. And right. So I just wanted to quickly comment on that, because Origen is a unique case where we have someone who translated a 4th century figure who translated his work on Principles, one of his most famous works, from Greek to Latin. In the preface of the translation, admits that he's altering Origen's text, right? So
even the texts we have are altered, and that's the case, as we're going to talk about more with Ignatius. But just finishing up, since you brought up Origen, and that's a big one, right? We have Origen openly stating that the best copies of the Greek Septuagint have the divine name in Paleo-Hebrew, yet none of the surviving main traditions have that in them. All of his works were destroyed. Well, we won't get off on that, but it's a feature that shows a change. We know they destroyed his texts. Okay, so you think he's a heretic. Well, what about the earlier Christians like Ignatius is dealing with, who he thinks are causing division because they want to go to the archives? What'd you do with their texts? Because you destroyed Origen's massive hexapla of the Old Testament that would have preserved for us so much information that would be usable by any denomination. Yet because of your hatred for his views, which you in large parts accept even today, you literally destroyed his biblical texts.
Yeah.
So to tell us that wouldn't have been the case earlier or at other times for the same or other similar reasons is not the case. And so with Ignatius, right, we have people who do something similar. We have his text, like with Rufinus, we have him actually defending Origen, right?
Exactly.
He's, I think, changing it to make him more palatable so they don't condemn him. Because you had Epiphanius, you had Theodoret, and you had Jerome, right, condemning him. So I think the motives aren't always necessarily sinister, but they nonetheless show a yielding to the prevailing authority and doctrine of the day over the text. Right. The author, whether it's the biblical author or a later Christian writer, these people, I'm talking about them in general related to their tradition, the ones who refer to these people and support these events, this is what they do and have done since Ignatius, I would say since the New Testament and the Old, like we were just talking about with Origen, destroyed the hexapla. To me, that's a primary example of what they'll do if they don't agree with your copy of the Bible during those earlier times. So with Ignatius, right, in the 4th century, we have similar with Rufinus and Origen. We have them doing this with Ignatius. We have Arians or others changing things. It's not always Arianism, but it could be different Trinitarian views or different ways of understanding even the Trinity that lead to these changes. And so trying to rely on a text tradition for Ignatius is nearly impossible. All right, so if we set aside the long tradition, we try to make things simple like they try to do with the middle, best Greek, relates to Eusebius, but like with the Latin that dates from the 10th and later, that they relate to earlier events that supposedly explain the readings.
Mhm.
They do the same thing with the Greek, right? So even though we do have the Greek represented by Eusebius in the 4th century, kind of early to mid 4th century, it's after him, the texts used are dated from the 10th century. Okay, we have a couple fragments dated to the 3rd century that have part of Smyrnans, but it's the 10th century manuscript that primarily is used for the Greek tradition that relates to Eusebius in the 4th century. Okay, you may say, well, okay, so we have 4th century texts verified by Eusebius in large part for the Middle Recension, 7 letters. That sounds good, right? We get a lot of information from Eusebius. The problem is, as we just discussed, the short recension, Syriac tradition that actually has text representation earlier than the best Greek tradition, and that is often cited by people like Sam, conflicts with over 50% of the letters represented by Eusebius as authentic Ignatian tradition. So Eusebius says 7, best available Greek tradition, dated to the early 4th century. Syriac tradition, best available, dated to essentially the same period, late 3rd or 4th century, says only 3 letters are authentic. That's saying 4 of those 7 are not authentic. So what? Okay, this tells us a lot. It tells me a lot. It tells me, number one, we don't have a consistent Ignatian tradition, period. We don't have it in any language version. Can we come up with readings that are represented across the traditions in ways that provide us what we can reliably call most likely what Ignatius wrote? Yeah, that's what we do with a lot of stuff. It doesn't happen as much with Ignatius because it's a complicated tradition and people don't often spend the time to do that. And or it eliminates so many other readings that they want to use, they just don't have the interest. So if you go from the Greek tradition, best 7 letters, middle recension, represented earliest by Eusebius, then you're going to have 4 to 5 or more times as many references to Jesus as God or our God, and as many or more times references to the bishop, deacons, and presbytery as elevated in ways that correspond to God, Jesus, and the counsel of God, way beyond the New Testament, then you're going to find in the short recension. In the short recension, you only find 1, and I believe even that is disputed in terms of it's not in the Greek tradition. So the Syriac short tradition does have a reference to Jesus as our God, but it's not in the Greek tradition. And you do have a couple references elevating the bishop and the presbytery beyond what's acceptable per the New Testament, nowhere near what the Greek tradition has. Okay, so someone is changing something, and the reasons appear clear. Doctrinal and hierarchical. Those are the references that are multiplied the most in these traditions and or not in them. So did Ignatius elevate the bishop and the presbytery to such an extent as we find in the Greek tradition or not? Was it more like the Syriac short? We don't know. No one can answer that question because I just went over the information we have. Now, we have a couple fathers, right? We have, and these fathers themselves have suspect manuscript histories and traditions, meaning we don't have like original or even close to original writings of Polycarp or Irenaeus. We do have some texts that are a little bit earlier or closer to the Smyrnan fragments we have of Ignatius for a couple of them. But Polycarp refers to letters received sent by Ignatius. He does not specify them. He does not name them. And he admits at the end of that very reference in Philadelphians 13 that he doesn't know enough. He asked the people who tell him or brought the letters for more information about Ignatius. So there's clearly there's no support there that would help us resolve whether the short or middle recensions are more correct than the others. And it doesn't quote from it, I don't believe. We can check that. I did cite those. Irenaeus quotes from Ignatius, but again, one quotation does not establish an entire letter, let alone how many letters are in a tradition. So we have Irenaeus referencing Ignatius and quoting him, but again,
You want me to pull up your document, Greg?
Yeah, you can
be helpful.
Other references. I think they're near just below the
Yeah,
manuscript summary I provided.
Yeah.
I provide
So
right
how's
there.
this? Is this able to, is this coming in clear? You can see that well?
Yeah, so we reviewed all that. That gives a little more details. I can see
you want me to read it at all? I can read it if you'd like, or if you want me to just go down to Irenaeus.
Or I think people can stop it if they want to read it and check it. It essentially gives the letters in each tradition, the dates of the significant texts. I reviewed it all, but it's there.
So if you guys want, Greg basically already reviewed it. You can kind of screenshot this if you want to save it. That's the Greek section, Greek text. Then you got a section here on Syriac. All right. So just take that down. And then Latin text and other language versions, middle recension. And then, Greg, this is the section that he's talking about now. Some of the comments on Ignatius, at least, I mean, at the very least, kind of acknowledging that the guy existed, and at least seemingly.
I said I meant
and that there's some correspondence, that there's supposedly some correspondence between Polycarp and Ignatius. By the way, I mentioned it earlier, but Polycarp also is said to be, somehow a disciple of John. This is the claim that they have going from the their traditions anyway. Whether or not this is true, I don't know. I'm very skeptical of that, but nevertheless, this is what they claim. So these are
that Ignatius met Polycarp, which we don't have evidence of, and which scholars in the field like Rios Campos disagree, does not believe that's the case. Rios Campos, in fact, I did a video on Ignatius recently where I highlighted him and his reconstruction of the 7 middle recension letters into 4 letters, but he takes parts of, this is how interpolated the Greek text is. It's pretty bad, where you're literally getting parts of other letters in other letters that the interpolator put there in order to construct these different texts, according to at least Rios Campos. And he has a lot of convincing arguments that, again, I don't agree entirely. There are other views. There are a lot of views of Ignatius because there's so much going on. But you can see right here, this is the reference in Polycarp, whose text, again, is over 1,000 years, basically, from when this is said to have been written, right? But nevertheless, if we accept it as legitimate, it's not the Masoretic text, but we'll go with it. Philippians 13, he refers to those who brought him. You wrote to me, both ye yourselves and Ignatius. And then he talks about the letters of Ignatius, which were sent to him by him in 13:2, and then the red part. And then he says, so he's aware of Ignatius in these letters, at least according to the 1,000-year later tradition of Polycarp. He says, but moreover, concerning Ignatius himself and those that were with him, if ye have any sure tidings, certify us. There's clearly not a comprehensive awareness or detailed understanding or correspondence with Ignatius and the people with him. They're aware of some things. It appears they may have been sent some actual letters. We don't know which ones. He doesn't say. And we have competing traditions that contradict each other, that are both cited by the very parties relying on them. So this tells us almost nothing unless we accept it as actually from 1st to 2nd century time and legitimately stating he got some letters that are not named from Ignatius, but doesn't know anything else.
Yeah. And I just want to read quickly, just a small quote here from Lightfoot, who is very relevant to this discussion, but just to kind of show you how bizarre it is if you're a Christian or Trinitarian who is familiar with this evidence. Like, Ignatius is one of the last people that you would really want to use because there's so many problems with this text, right? So Lightfoot said this, and Lightfoot is somebody who's extremely, I would say, extremely sympathetic to Ignatius, trying to get the most out of him. But he says this. This is a quote from Lightfoot. The Ignatian epistles are an exceptionally good training ground for the student of early Christian literature and history. They present in typical and instructive forms the most varied problems, most varied problems, textual, exegetical, doctrinal, and historical. So Lightfoot is admitting that these are good, kind of texts to get involved in for an early student who wants to get involved in this stuff. But he's admitting they have the most problems textually, doctrinally, exegetical, and historical. So even if we granted some of these things, for a Trinitarian to build their case or attempt to try to build their case so strongly on Ignatius is just bizarre to me, Greg. I mean, it's like he has, as Lightfoot, who you know because you're familiar with the literature surrounding Ignatius on this, and Lightfoot, I think, for whatever reason, I think he's a little bit to blame for some of these theories of just accepting the middle recension, like, oh, this is just a gospel type of thing. But nevertheless, he's admitting that in all the early Christian writings, Ignatius has the most problems, right? So why would you want to build or attempt to build your case so strongly on somebody like Ignatius? I don't know. That's just something I wanted to mention because I don't want people to think, because I'm a Muslim,
good point,
you're a Christian, but you're not Trinitarian. I try to use, and all throughout my book, I try to do this. I try to use sources most of the time that are sympathetic to the Trinitarian narrative and that many Trinitarians like Shamoun would be sympathetic towards, like Lightfoot. And even they are admitting these things. Like it's just crazy to me how they can just so boldly say, oh, look, here's this text, just like Sam, just pulling up, oh, this letter from Ignatius to the Ephesians or whoever it is, just quote it. Oh, it says Jesus is God. Oh, there we go. We got the Trinity. Like, this is just so low tier Christian apologetics that really people who read these things in any amount of detail should not take seriously. Sorry, I just wanted to mention that because Lightfoot is extremely important in this context. And even he is admitting that Ignatius's epistles have the most problems pretty much of any early text.
No, it's a good point because of that reason and the fact that they use him. But I think it's because they can't use Clement of Rome, right? Because he's the other earlier non-apostle Christian writer who's even in the Codex Alexandrinus, his first and second letters. So we actually have more reason to rely on him, but he doesn't give us any of this kind of Jesus is our God talk. But Ignatius, the Ignatian tradition, so commonly translated into English, does. So for the common person, that's carries a little bit more weight. And I think most people, especially Sam, they just don't think people are, it's changing. I think that people are becoming more aware. It's mattering more than just an English translation that's been around for over 100 years. While it's still important, there's more going on. And when it comes to, like you and I were talking about earlier, the meaning of God, see, they know most people when they see that, whether it's Thomas or Ignatius, they're not prepared. They should be, because it's pretty easy to explain, but because of the limitations of our English vocabulary and that word and so many translations, capital God, it's just hard once people see, they're so used to fighting against that applying to Jesus. Once it is, they kind of have a harder time. So they're seizing on that. And then you have the Orthodox and Catholics love the whole bishop presbytery elevation in Ignatius. To them, that legitimizes their whole structure in large part.
Right. Anything more on this? Oh, I think there's something here from Irenaeus. Did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so this is the other allegedly early. I say allegedly because while we do believe Irenaeus actually lived when he is said to have and written in the 2nd century, we nonetheless like with Polycarp, do not have early representation of his writings. We have 10th, 11th century Latin or 13th century Armenian texts that are mostly used for Irenaeus, who is supposed to have written in Greek, right? And he quotes Ignatius here. So whereas in the prior quotation from Philippians in Polycarp, that is itself not helpful to this whole canon of Ignatius and content of Ignatius and other particulars of Ignatius question or issue, Irenaeus actually quotes him one time from his best represented letter, right? So the letter to the Romans has its own special tradition in the Greek middle recension that puts it above the others, other six of the seven, and then for Rios Campos, it's still probably the best of the four reconstructed. But it's also in the Syriac tradition. So Romans is kind of considered the best letter of Ignatius in many respects. But Irenaeus, quoting from that best represented letter, does so in a way that differs from both the Syriac and the Greek text. He quotes Ignatius as referring to the wheat of Christ, whereas Ignatius in the best Greek and Syriac traditions, it's wheat of God. No, this is a significant term, right? This is not like just the word the or, because these are theologically loaded terms that are changed in a quotation of a person that we know practically nothing about apart from these very suspect and conflicting traditions. So this is our only quotation of Ignatius from these early writers from around 200 CE. Or actually, that's what we have our best representation for. That's kind of what I'm getting at there. For part of Irenaeus's writings, we have some representation closer, excuse me, to the time when he wrote, around the end of the second century, 100s. But but beyond the early support we have around 200 for book 3, we're referring to book 5 of Irenaeus against heresies, where he quotes Ignatius here, where this difference is found, for which we have support from later Latin and Armenian texts primarily. So again, it's not just Ignatius, it's everybody, right? And yeah, maybe if you're quoting from book 3 of Irenaeus against heresies, you're going to have a reliable maybe even written by Irenaeus in some people's view, in that one 200 CE dated text of book 3 against heresies. Outside of that, okay, we're way beyond the time of Irenaeus, like we are way beyond the time of Ignatius in every tradition, unless you're going to put a very small part of the early part of Smyrnans, which is from the 3rd century. And so again, about 200 years after Ignatius would have written it. We had the whole Origen controversy we referenced. He was in the mid-3rd century, and look what they did to him, right? So acting like people like Ignatius or the New Testament even weren't subject to this kind of wholesale change or even destruction. I just point to Origen and say you have both his writings and his biblical texts that anyone who really cared could have preserved. And even if you didn't like his writings, said, hey, thanks for the hexpla, no thanks for your writings. A Trinitarian, if they didn't. They had their own tradition of text authority they wanted to preserve apart from Origen, and even amended his writings. So we have this similar thing with Ignatius, who really doesn't quote. He quotes one part from John 3, but he's not really reliant a lot on these texts. He even says in one of his writings, he's arguing with people who kept referring to the written archives. And he's like, look, it is written in Jesus Christ, right? And he talks about special knowledge and things that we can get into if you want. The point is, we don't have much support, if any, verifying the number of letters for Ignatius for sure. We only have a quotation from one that's from a much later source text of an earlier writer who doesn't have the same quotation he's quoting from Ignatius represented in the 2 other best traditions. So you see how wild this gets. But once you see it and you understand it, this is like flows like water, but this is not a simple thing to grasp. It's sufficient to know that we don't have a reliable tradition. Anyone who tells you that for Ignatius, I would argue even for people like Irenaeus, Polycarp, and Origen, more so for Origen in some ways, but not really. They're fooling you. They're relying on later writers and later texts that they're assuming are representative of these early people.
I do want to sorry to detour, because several people are mentioning this now. Brother Jack, it's Jake, by the way, but can you visit the Orthodox Muslim at the hospital? He is in Marrakesh at a clinic. Yeah, for people who don't know, he's here and he's sick. I live in Marrakesh. I've spoken to him, and he's just not feeling up to it as of now. But I would be happy to visit him. People know that I've had some differences with him in the past, and some things that I think need to still be worked out, but I wish him the best. I ask that God heals him, and I would be happy to visit him in the hospital. So, yeah, because some people are saying, no, I don't want to visit him. I would be happy to. He's just, and I'm in contact with him. He just hasn't been feeling up to it yet. So, I just wanted to dispel this notion that people are talking about in the chat here. Anyway, back to it, Greg. So maybe, I mean, because we've spoken a lot now about the textual transmission of Origin, and not Origin, well, we have to, but Ignatius and some of the problems with Ignatius. But based upon what we have, and this is a difficult question to answer maybe, but based upon the best available evidence that we have from Ignatius, before going into specific texts, what would be your position as to Ignatius's Christology? Do you think he was a modalist? Do you think he was a subordinationist? Do you think there's any room to give to the Trinitarians that he actually was a Trinitarian? What's kind of your view on his overall Christology based upon what we have?
You know, it's interesting. He does say several things that will inform the opinion I'll give in a moment, but he also says a few things that make me wonder, what was he thinking? Because he talks about, kind of like you can see on the screen right now, Trailing 5:2. He says he has this, he seems to imply he has a special comprehension of the powers and the heavenly things, what we typically associate with later, quote, heretics or others that don't have necessarily a biblical view. But either way, he claims to have this kind of developed special understanding, and he does talk about a couple things that, together with those types of statements, can only lead you to think that he understood what he was saying. So if that's the case, and he claimed to, he didn't just show that by he's like telling us, hey, I can comprehend this stuff, this special stuff about the invisible powers and angels. I got this. So when he starts talking about it, I think we should look at that and say, all right, well, what did these terms mean in the context of his writings and at the time, and based on what he's familiar with, New Testament type stuff and other belief systems of his day. So to me, he essentially is a modalist. And by that, I mean one who believes in the ultimate God as the Father, who existed alone by himself as one, even uses that term, in silence. But that he then spoke the word, the logos. And he talks about in other texts where he discusses speaking and existing in silence, how that is your action versus your being known without acting. So I believe that he understood the Father was the ultimate, how he understood universal power, we'll say it based on some of the things he says, ultimate invisible God who was alone in silence, but who at some point spoke the word, who then became the man Jesus, and did other things too, but ultimately became the man Jesus. So he sees Jesus as exactly the same as the Father, hence unbegotten and begotten, visible and invisible. He says he understands those things right here. We'll get to later. And that he talks about things that to me imply that the Father's actually the one who is the Son. The Son is the Father's mind, as we'll get to. The Son is the Father's will. The Father suffers like the Son does. The Father raises the Son's physical body, but in the New Testament accounts, Jesus says he's going to raise it up. And in the Christian tradition that I am a part of, we believe the Father raised him first as a spirit, and then he rose his own physical body. That's how we harmonize that. Galatians 1:1, John 2:19. For Ignatius, though, that's not what he's doing. Okay, this is where when you said earlier, neither one of us agree with this guy, right? Because he says things in a way that are not aligned with the Bible. He even, like you're seeing right here in Philadelphians 8:2, he's arguing, calling them divisive when they point to the archives, the written records, and saying something different. So he talks about the Father in that way, as I think essentially a pure modalist who believes that the Father assumes different modes of activity to accomplish his will, but in the process of doing so becomes the Son, the Jesus of history, that is also then referred to by Jesus in this sort of associative manner or way with the Father, with God. But they're still the same, other than being different modes. That's how I understand his theology.
Okay. In my research for Ignatius for my book, it seems that scholarship is a little bit divided, and this is where I'm not really sure, so I kind of leave it as a little bit of an open question in the book, that some scholars take Ignatius in the way that you do, in a more modalist kind of understanding, while others see him as a subordinationist, in that, the Son is distinct from the Father, but he is completely subordinate to the Father in a significant way. And let me see. I want to see actually if you have the passage up here.
Well, while you look at that, I'll comment on it, because I see that as well, and I don't discount that as a potential view. It's just in harmonizing everything he says, it seems like he's implying or teaching a modalistic type subordination. But so, like, just to qualify, like I said earlier, when the Father speaks the word, so when I say he speaks him into existence and he's created there, well, I believe the Father is the Word, right? So yes. So I have a video I did recently about Philo, creation and time. People can look it up if they want to discuss it. I did a video recently about the Bible and time. There's a lot more I could say, but 2 videos where I discuss this essentially in the Bible and in Philo, on the creation and allegorical interpretation of Genesis. He makes it very clear that time is created in the physical sense when the days of creation happen, where the sun, moon, and stars are put to mark times and seasons, like Genesis says. But he says things outside of that are eternal, even the heavens and the earth that were created before the actual sun, moon, and stars on those days, and other things like light and darkness, and anything in the invisible and corporeal realm, even though they happen or occur and are quote unquote eternal in the ultimate sense, just in the non-physical temporal time-based sense that he's talking about. They still occur, right? So God still comes up with the plan, the logos, when he starts to create the plan. He conceives of the plan and then acts on it as the logos, or uses the logos in Philo's view. So there's events happening sequentially in ways that are measured both from the time they happen and when they didn't happen. So like in Ignatius saying the Father, the word proceeded from silence. Okay, well, we don't have sun, moon, and stars measuring that event, so it's outside of time in that way. He's beyond time in that way, even a quote Sam abuses there, because he doesn't understand time in that way. He's talking about being outside of time in that respect, not being calculated by the sun, moon, and stars time scale, but he specifically says the word proceeds from silence. So then there was a time the word didn't proceed from silence. Therefore, it's measurable. How do we measure it? Well, we're not there, and we didn't observe it like God did in a way that we could account for when it happened relative to something else. It's outside of our experience. It's outside of our actual ability to comprehend, even though we know it's there, because they say it happened. It's like God being eternal. We know he's there eternally, and I can argue that scientifically, but we weren't there. We can't understand it fully because we did begin. So the question is, what does the text say? If the text says he spoke the word from silence, well, to me, even in Ignatius, some argue that God is silence, and so he essentially came forth from God. I don't think that's true. It's a different word for silence in the two references that I'm talking about and I talk about. The fact is, though, he's still proceeding forth from and didn't before. That's time. That's the only means of time. The only difference is how you're measuring it and whether it's invisible or visible. So I am not hard and fast that he's like this pure modalist, but the things he says that I see as pure modalism are hard for me to discount, right? If he's the mind of the Father, well, that's pretty much everything except the body. And so, and it talks about the blood of God, right? In a way that's not correct, as well as the flesh of Jesus. So, they usually need us a lot for the Eucharist type stuff, but I don't think it's correct the way they do it. I don't think it's the literal blood of God. It's more like the New Testament represents it in a way. But not that aside, they mean it in a more literal way. And Ignatius kind of seems to, that suggests to me a modalistic leaning for sure. And then the whole Father raised up his flesh. But he says elsewhere in his own writings, he says this, Jesus raised up his flesh and he is the mind of God. The Father, not just the mind of God, but the Father. And that's very important. Right. So I don't discount subordinationism or that he's similar, kind of how I see it relative to the New Testament, that he's created as the Word in a way that allows him to proceed as a separate spirit being, but that is not a competing agent against God, but that is effectively God's image, but more like the developed Valentinian type understanding, or even as he's talking about here, right, this kind of special understanding that they have of the pleroma and the aeons, right? So there's this kind of cosmogony that is around these people and associated with these people that it could fall in line with depending on when these things were actually written. But totality of what he says about God, Jesus, and even the Holy Spirit, he says it's Jesus, Holy Spirit, doesn't really make it a possession of the Father that he sends to the Son. To me, suggests more of a modalistic understanding of God. But definitely I see what you're saying on the subordinationism. The Son is definitely the Son, the Word. Those are subordinate modes, in my view, of the Father, but he's still the Father, still the mind of the Father.
Okay. Yeah. So I just pulled up a text here that you had included, which, some scholars have understood it this way, and I quote it in my book and I reference them. Just to kind of give both sides of it. And that would be this passage, Ephesians 7:2, which we know that the Trinitarians love this text, even though it's beyond me, because I think it buries them in multiple ways. And we'll see how that is. But I just want to get your thoughts on this, because I do see that. And I'm just being honest, Greg, from my point of view, I see texts where it's like, well, it really kind of seems like the modalism that Greg is talking about. But then I see passages like this and I'm thinking, I don't know, this kind of seems like subordinationist here. So Ephesians 7:2 says, and for people who know, this is like a typical quote mine that Trinitarians use, like Dr. White, who, I wouldn't put him in the same camp as Sam Shamoun. I have a little bit more respect for him. But nevertheless, he does misuse some of these texts. And this text says there is one, and it's on the screen there, the top text, if people are following along. There is one only physician of flesh and spirit, generate and ingenerate, God in man, true life in death, Son of Mary and Son of God, first passible and then impassible, Jesus Christ our Lord. So you have these, kind of almost contradictory properties that are ascribed to the one being Jesus Christ, right? You have that he's flesh and spirit, generate and ingenerate, right? God and man. And then the point that scholars have pointed out, and which I think is significant, he says first passible and then impassible. Right. And that gives the impression that initially Christ was a passible being, one who is subject to change or different emotional states. That's what this passibility stuff means. And And I mean, I can say more about my position. I think that even that kind of idea comes from pagan Greek thought, because I think that both the text of the Bible and the Quran presents a God who does experience these different, I don't really like to say emotional states, but does have these different experiences throughout time, whereas a lot of I think the influence from Greek paganism has this idea of God as completely beyond space and time, whatever that is supposed to mean, and doesn't even experience succession in whatever it may be. And therefore, that's why they created this idea of Jesus being the intermediary. But anyway, nevertheless, you have Christ, who is said to be first. And the idea that it presents is that you have a being who is passible, so not fully God in the sense that people like Ignatius may have understood the Father to be completely impassible. And then Christ, either, most would, mark it as after the resurrection. So post-resurrection, now he becomes this impassible being. And that kind of supports the subordinationist narrative, where he is a passible being, and then in light of the resurrection, he becomes impassible. Now, that's very difficult even to imagine, but if you granted it for the sake of argument, that he's going from an attribute that would be typically ascribed to man in the way that Ignatius or these other people would understand it, and then later gets this divine-like quality of impassibility. So I think the order of things is very important in this text. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Greg. Would you grant that kind of, at least in that part of this quote, seems to support a subordinationist understanding?
I do see your point about the order. I think that's a reasonable observation, that it listing first the physical, essentially, or fleshly, or passible, and then the impassible or the ungenerate. Does that?
Yeah, like it's even those ones are there. Yeah.
So I would say that's a good point, but that the reason he does that is because he's focusing on the Christians themselves and their development from the human standpoint forward. Like kind of in 9:1, like you have up in there, says, I've learned certain persons pass through you from yonder, bringing evil doctrine, whom you suffered not to sow seed in you, for you stopped your ears so that you might not receive the seed sown in them, as much as your stones of a temple, which were prepared beforehand, a building of God the Father, which I relate to other texts. That's why I highlight that later. So I would say that it's the reason that the order is the way that it is the perspective that he has of the human Christians that he's talking to, that he's viewing it from the human condition forward, not necessarily providing the order of existence for Jesus.
Okay. I mean, yeah, that's another interpretation.
I would add, just to add to that, not to that specific point, but the whole unbegotten itself is contradictory to later fathers. And to me,
yeah, that's true.
Even though you make a good, the order is as you stated, I would say that overall the terms are more applicable, especially based on later fathers, to the Father, and lend themselves to the modalistic understanding, apart from what you pointed out with regard to the order. So if you understood the order in the way that I did, as dealing overall from the human condition forward, not necessarily with Jesus' condition forward, then you would see a Ignatius more as supportive of the modalistic understanding. If not, if you see it as more in the order that it's presented in Ephesians 7:2, that wouldn't necessarily have to do with the modalistic view that I believe is there.
Right. But in either case, right, and I agree with you, because For people who don't know, the later 4th century doctrine of eternal generation of the Son, in the way that the Trinitarians understand it, Christ, or the Son, or the Word, is not understood to be ungenerate, right, Greg? He's not understood to be ingenerate. He's understood to be generated from the Father. So there's really no sense. Forget about his human nature. Even in his as a divine person, right, that he is generated by the Father. So Greg is pointing out, by the fact that this text, Ephesians 7:2, calls him ingenerate, in some sense, that is also at odds with the later Nicene understanding that no, he's not ingenerate in any sense, even in his divine nature, or in his as a divine person, he's still generated by the Father. So if you understand Christ, or the Son, to be ingenerate, then Greg is pointing out that that would kind of support the modalist interpretation, because only the Father is ingenerate, on a Trinitarian understanding, or maybe what Ignatius would have been working with here. So am I understanding your point there correctly, Greg? And I'll just give you a chance to comment, and I'm just going to grab a book real quickly, but I'm listening.
Sure. No, I think you captured everything just fine. I'll just add more on the eternal generation, because you brought that up, and it relates to this text right here. Right. So eternal generation ultimately stems from Origen, but they condemned Origen and they don't fully align with him, but he kind of gave the idea that they developed into what they believe today. Now you have other writers like Tertullian, but so it doesn't matter that they believe that it's eternal generation. Not only is that as a concept absurd on its face, which I'll comment on in a moment why, but in those very writings by Origen and Tertullian, it's not the same as Orthodox Christianity, right? So in Tertullian, he's not eternally the Son, even if he's eternally generated. And in Origen, he's eternally generated, but he's still, the subordinationism in Origen is not compatible with Trinitarianism. And I ultimately don't think that either one, especially Origen, is operating in the same mindset of time that most Trinitarians, if not all of them, are operating on today, especially in the apologetic arena, but that was more prevalent during those times. And so the difference between time and a creature in time of the physical universe is different, and spoken of different, and conceived of differently than something generated in the realm of eternity. So it wouldn't be the Greek concept of eternal generation that you do find, but it's more this Middle Platonic view of eternity that Philo even attributes to Moses, where all the invisible things are and even occur, but outside of time, meaning the physical universe, not that they don't happen. So does eternal generation ultimately involve the Son happening? Well, I think for Tertullian, it clearly does. And I think in just pure reason and reality, it has to, right? So if God's nature is, especially Middle Platonism, not affected, right? He doesn't move. In Origen, right? Origen questions this whole idea of God's inactivity and stuff like that is in Philo. And, but for Philo, right, people closer to Ignatius, and Origen wasn't even there yet. So this concept of time and such, things absolutely happen in the invisible and corporeal realm. They're just not in time the way things that are created in this realm universe are. So there's definitely distinction in measurement in ways that relate to some views of this eternal generation and not to some, but that ultimately come down to this question. Does the Bible teach it, and or is it supportable by the Bible and reason? So let's just go to reason for a moment, because they assume this whole concept of time in the Bible, like in John 1:1, which contradicts what the Bible actually says in John 1:1, and is not consistent with what the Bible says about time, as I've shown. So what they do is they just assume it's more Middle Platonic, things are eternal. So even if the Son is the Son or only begotten, he's eternal generation, what ultimately becomes. All right, so let's look at that. If God's nature is ultimately eternal, and you can't change it, right? It doesn't change. Well, what is begetting? Begetting by itself, by definition, the word itself requires an act.
Of course, yeah.
In Trinitarianism, right? What they end up doing is just contradicting the very thing they're claiming. They do this a lot. So know all things, don't know things. You've said nothing. You just said nothing. So it's contradict. It's kind of like word magic, I call it. Anyway, on this time thing, though, so they create this situation where with Ignatius and Philo, right, this whole unbegotten thing, right? So does God's nature, eternal nature that doesn't change, at least in Philo and we'll say the New Testament period and Ignatius, what happens when it's generated, right? I think it's what motivated Origen to realize God has to do some things, of course. But they're saying that the nature is not affected by the generation. This is what gets William Lane Craig stumped, right? Because they're saying essentially that something happens with respect to the Son that they don't apply to the nature, that they only apply to the person, that they say both are eternal, that are never split up in any actual example in reality. They split up in their philosophy and say, well, the Son was always there as the mind or reason abstraction of God that conversed with him, but his nature, what he became as the Son, is considered only begotten. Even that doesn't make sense because they share the exact same nature according to them. And so you'd be saying part of the nature, which they don't split in parts, is begotten, and part of it is unbegotten, exactly what you see in Ignatius right here. So how does that work? Well, it can't work. You can't have one single solitary nature. You can't have a son born within a father. Even a Siamese-Trimese twin doesn't work like that. So they try to say the son's eternally generated, but he's not temporal, and the nature's not affected. Oh, yeah, and his glory is called that of an only begotten, but he's eternal and it doesn't affect the nature. And yet the Father's not called the glory of an only begotten. The Father's not called begotten, but the Son is, and it doesn't change anything. You see, it's just
bizarre.
It's not possible to deal with on an irrational or biblical level, but it's to me part of the plan to keep people confused. Again, it's like you go and talk about Ignatius earlier. Why do they use it? Well, it's the least supportable, textually text to use of these people, and yet they do so because it confuses people. So things like what they talk about with respect to time confuses people. When it comes to only begotten confuses people. He's begotten from eternity. You contradicted the very use of the term. Why are you using that term? Why don't you just say he's eternal? Because he's begotten. Oh, that means he's not eternal. Oh, but he is. Oh, but he's not. You see, you get into this. It's like arguing with a child with someone who hasn't learned what words mean yet, but they don't know what they mean. So you're actually arguing with a child who does know what he means, and that's stupid. We end up having to do it because they're in control. They're the dominant voice, and they use it to confuse people and put us down, make us look stupid. So we don't have much of a choice, but it ultimately is pretty ridiculous.
Yeah. Greg, I don't know if you've come across this. I'm very interested in this topic of God and time. I actually argue with other Muslims about some of their views, which I think are bizarre. So I don't know how much we have in way of conversions, but based on some of the things you're saying now and other things, I think we have more agreement than disagreement on some of these points. And this is a very interesting book by R.T. Mullins. For anybody who's interested, don't know if you come across it, but it's published by Routledge, and it's called From Divine Time Maker to Divine Watchmaker. And it's something that I think you intuitively are picking up on. And I think maybe, although I don't agree with everything he says in the book, don't get me wrong, but he does make some interesting points. And
I've heard about him. I've not read that, but people have asked me about him, and I've seen some videos. Ryan Mullins, right?
Yeah. So he was one of the professors actually in my master's program. Actually, he cites me in the book on page 128 because I helped give him some sources with respect to Islam, some of the Islamic sources relating to God and time. So he mentions me. But anyway, as I said, I don't agree with everything he says there. But one important thing that you are picking up on, which I completely agree with, and which is basically forms the whole thesis for his book here, is he makes a distinction between what we would call created time, if you want to phrase it that way, in the sense of having to do with planetary motion, right? Mm-hmm. And then time, you can say simplicator, or in and of itself. And basically what he's saying is that they're two different senses of time, right? You have the time which has to do with the planetary motion, which obviously is not quote unquote eternal or always existing. God created that at a specific moment in time. But prior to that, there still was another sense of time in which God existed within that, right? And
I agree with that.
And, yeah, so I agree with that. And that's why he says we should think of it from God being from divine time maker, because not only Christians, but Muslims will say, well, God is the creator of time. Well, what do you mean by that? Because if there's a before and after, for him to even have that before and after to create, there already had to kind of be a sense of time, right? So Mullins is critiquing that, and I would agree with that critique, that God is not the creator of time in the way that many modern Christians or Muslims would imagine. God is the creator of the watch. That's why he says from divine time maker to divine watchmaker. God is the creator of time in the sense of planetary motion time and a watch that kind of records that time. But he's not the creator of time simplicator in the sense of, just succession. It's just it's from one moment to the next. That's just kind of a natural progression of any being that is alive in that sense, that experiences succession. So anyway, I don't know, my brain was just kind of buzzing when you were talking about these things, because he goes into a lot of that here. A precursor to that book is another book published by Oxford, which I think is related to his PhD thesis, and he calls it The End of the Timeless God. And in that, he actually goes through Augustine and different earlier church figures on some of their positions related to time. And I mean, I don't know exactly what your position is, Greg. And like I said, you can be honest. I even said this beforehand. You can disagree with me on certain things on the stream. It's perfectly fine. It's not like we have this hidden alliance that we have to agree with each other on everything just because we're taking down this, deceiver Sam Shamoun. But I don't believe in this concept of a God that is completely outside of time and space in any sense, that he's like almost like a frozen picture. He doesn't experience any motion, the sort of unmoved mover. I don't believe in this concept of God. I think it's pagan. I think it comes from earlier Greek pagan thought. I believe in a dynamic conception of God, one who actually experiences succession and does different things at different times and can interact with his creation in the sense of creating one thing. Like Greg is slightly older than me, created Greg at a certain time, and then he created Jake at another time. It just seems obvious. And the entire, biblical corpus of language, as well as the Quranic corpus, it seems very obvious in a natural way of just interpreting the text that God is clearly doing different things at different times. And he speaks to different people at different times, right? So this idea of this, what I call like frozen picture conception of God, I think is completely pagan and antithetical to the biblical and Quranic text. But that's my view. I'm actually very passionate about that subject. I think that it's very important because even more so than other distortions of the scriptures, the amount of time, or the amount of times, or, I would say the amount of time that God is described as doing different things at different times is so far beyond any consideration about whether Jesus is God or not in the Bible or mentioned in the Quran, that if you can distort those texts, this is kind of my argument. we call by greater reason, or in Arabic, min bab al-awla, that by greater reason, if you can distort who God is with respect to his relationship to time or how he acts, right? The amount of text that you have to distort to do that are so far beyond than any of the amount of text that, well, is Jesus really called God here in the 10 or 12 passages in the New Testament? And if so, what is meant by it? If you can distort who God is with his relationship to time, which are so much more vast, the amount of passages you have to do this, well, then, of course, you could do that very easily with Jesus being, the Most High God, a part of a Trinity or anything like that. And the same thing with certain other errors that I would say in Islamic theology and these different groups that we have too, because we have deviants too and heretics, even in the Islamic tradition. So that's kind of my view. I'm sorry for rambling, but when you kept talking about and making this distinction between, sort of created time or time that's based upon planetary motion, and there are even different conceptions of that. Like we have a solar calendar and a lunar calendar, right? Versus time simplicator, or just bare succession. There is a clear difference between the two. And the problem is that modern Christians and Muslims many times morph the two together as if we're just talking about the same thing. Well, we're not. They're two different senses. So anyway, I'm happy you can disagree with me on anything if you'd like, but I think you would get something out, especially this book. Well, really both of them. But I just want to recommend that.
I've heard about him, and I'm interested as well. And just to add on to what you're saying, I think we pretty much are very in line. I also don't see him as this eternal, unmoving, unchanging being, but very dynamic, like you said. And let me just push it back a little bit further, since this is so good. Correlate it and support it with something similar. So I see time as eternal in one sense, in the same way that God is eternal life. So for as long as God has been doing or thinking different things, he can determine when he did or thought something relative to the other thing he does and thinks in a way none of us can relate to. And so it's ultimately eternal in the sense that we can't track it, we can't measure it, but he can, just like his own life and existence. So beyond that, though, moving forward into what we can measure and track, we get, of course, to our physical reality and the things revealed to us from outside of it that tell us a little bit more, but not enough to be dogmatic. But still, it's very clear he's dynamic and active, eternal. Time is eternal only in that sense that he's eternal life, but that thereafter, everything he still does are measurable. We just can't see it. When we weren't there, we can't relate to it being that way. But as things progress and include us, there's no point in the time life of God that isn't measurable sequentially as things are thought or happen. The Trinitarians they would have to disprove sequentiality, which, as you just said, is all over the place in all these accounts, both about heaven and earth. So what are they talking about? Well, it's just their view. They're taking the abstraction of time, the measurement that it is, and making it a real thing that people or God are in or out. And if you're in it, you're created. And if you're outside of it, you're eternal, no matter whether you're begotten.
Right. I agree with that 100%, Greg. Yeah, I agree with that 100%. And actually, there's a hadith and a saying of the Prophet Muhammad that we believe is authentic, which I recommended to Ryan, and that's one of the things he included in the book and mentioned me in a footnote. Is there's a hadith where we believe that God says, "Do not curse time." And my understanding of that and interpretation of it is in exactly the sense that you understand it there, is that time, it's not just a sense that, oh, God, is the creator of time. Yeah, he's the creator of time in the sense of planetary motion time and what Ryan calls watchmaking time. But time simplicator is actually the result of or can be measured by God's internal actions. Exactly what you said, right? So from when God, for example, created the world and the moment prior to that, although there's not like a strict measurement in terms of, well, how many seconds there were, because there was no sun, moon, stars, and everything else, but there's still some difference in terms of succession, what I would call succession. There is a distinction in that.
Mhm.
I have an entire article. I mean, you probably wouldn't be too interested in it, but for Muslims who are watching this, I have an article which is called "The God of Aristotle is not the God of Abraham," and it's on my academia page, and I briefly go through what kind of Aristotle's view of God was and Plato's view of God was, and then I'm speaking about it from an Islamic paradigm. I talk about my understanding of the Quranic text and some early Islamic scholars who understood this in the same way that I do. And then you have these later deviants, heretics, unfortunately, who, they call themselves Muslims and they distort the text of God. And it's just so far beyond what the text actually says. So anyway, if people are interested in this from a more Islamic perspective, I do have an article on that where I argue, I think, very decisively, I mean, people can judge for themselves, that the God of Abraham and the God of Aristotle are not the same God. There are different conceptions. One is a static picture where it's just God, and it's weird. They say he's static, but then yet he's thinking of himself, which is weird because if he's thinking of himself, then somehow there would be some type of succession anyway, which is just weird. But nevertheless, you have this frozen picture of God where he's supposedly doing everything, but yet he's doing nothing at the same time, which is it's just so weird to me. But anyway, what I'm saying, and the Trinitarians do the same thing, right? They distort these texts about God and time and God and his interaction with creation. And so if they can do that when there's so much more numerous passages in the biblical text that prove that that's wrong, then of course they can do it about God's Messiah. I mean, it's just easy at that point, right? So from a hermeneutical standpoint, by greater reason, they can just easily distort these texts about God's Messiah. That's the way that I see it. Because I see it as a disease, an overall disease of which Trinitarianism is like a part of. But they do it even, I would argue, on sometimes greater scales and in more passages in the text, that it just makes it easy for them to do it when it comes to the Messiah.
It does, and it's similar to what we were talking about earlier textually, right? They know this is heavy. They know time is heavy. Once they bring it in, the likelihood that people are going to be able to go beyond the first level of evaluation is low. Same with textual history related to things like in Ignatius, they read in the Common English Translation. So they go there either ignorant of what's happening in many cases with respect to time, right? They just throw the word out. Well, God's not in time, right? Jesus is in time. That's before, he's before the worlds, before the ages.
He created time. He's the creator of time.
But they're banking on the fact that people that they're saying those things to aren't aware of the difference between the physical time that we exist in, where things happen because of what we do to measure it, and the spiritual realm or invisible realm where things still happen. We just don't measure them the same way.
Right, exactly, 100%. All right, that was I think a nice detour. I enjoyed that. Let's get back to Ignatius here. We kind of, jumped around a little bit, but are there any specific texts, Greg? Because there's a lot here. Is there any specific text? Maybe we can go over a couple more to kind of address. Actually, you know what? What was the one I think you really wanted to hit on about the bishop? We should deal with that. What do you think?
Yes. So there's a couple things, right? I guess if you wanted to do a quick scroll through, we could do it and not take much time. If you just scroll up a little to the Ephesians opening where it says the will of the Father and of Jesus Christ our God, it's probably important that we include that in here because
right here, right?
This is typically what you're going to get with Trinitarians, right? Stuff like this from Sam, very straightforward, right? See Jesus our God. Well, it's talking about one single will, and that of the Father and Jesus, which throughout is identified as the same mind, as I'm going to argue, being their God. So it doesn't talk about a Trinity. If anything, it talks about two persons being one God, which at this time, and the way he's talking about will and mind, is to me modalistic, but certainly not Trinitarian. So it's important that people at least know, hey, there's more attached to this our God reference than just calling him our God. there's this single will mind, and the Father's always there, understood as being in us as Jesus, as our God in some way, that's not Trinitarian. So texts like this are helpful because they'll kind of bring this thought together that, yeah, he's called our God in Ignatius, but there's something going on with Jesus and the Father that could be this or that, but it's not Trinitarian. So if we scroll down from there, okay, so Ephesians 2:2, I think here we can briefly just see where he's talking about submitting, right? One, submission to the bishop. So, right, he uses the word submission as a noun, hypotage, and then he also uses the verb hypotasso, submitting yourselves to the bishop, presbytery, in all things, he says. And then if you go down from that, he uses another verb. And let's see, and titiasestai. And so this is related to a verb, anthistemi. It's an infinitive form of that verb that's used, as you're going to see below in Galatians, by Paul. So Ignatius, in the text you just reviewed, used hypotage and the infinitive form of anthistemi as things you shouldn't do to the bishop, the presbytery, but you should submit in all things. This directly contrasts with what we read in Galatians 1 from Paul, who says he didn't submit, hypotage, and he opposed people like Peter and Thisteme, directly against what Ignatius is saying they're not supposed to do to the bishop or the presbytery. So this is a dramatic shift, in my opinion, going directly away from the counsel and actions of Paul, dealing with people like Peter and Judaizers there at the time with him, and he would not submit to them, right? So here Ignatius is telling everybody, submit to the bishop, right? Don't go to the archives and stuff. Submit to the bishop.
And that's something that the Catholics try to rely on, right? Greg, correct me if I'm wrong.
Them and the Eastern Orthodox, right? That's the whole thing, that, and especially in the Eastern Orthodox, this is their authority. This is their earliest authority outside the New Testament, Ignatius. He's the one who lines up all of this. He removes all the blocks to submitting to whatever the bishop says, which ends up being all this different doctrine and elevation of people way beyond what you see in the New Testament. Whereas Paul, by contrast, right here, using two of the same terms, says he did do those things Ignatius is telling people not to do. Plus, we have in Ephesians, the very people he's writing to, Ignatius, in Revelation 2, we have Jesus in that account speaking to them, saying they did a good job not submitting to the people who were claiming to be special and what they were saying, that they found they were liars. So we don't find that tone at all in Ignatius. It's the exact opposite, that we should not do those things in Revelation 2 or Galatians 1, you see right here. I think, to me, again, we get caught up in the Trinity, and that's significant because there's divergence there. It's not just that, right? There's a reason he's promoting this false view of God and Jesus, because he's out of control. It's not just that he has that wrong. He's got a lot of things wrong fundamentally that lead to a lot of these other wrongs and power structures that exist today. But it's directly against what you see being taught about in the New Testament here, and as I said, in Revelation 2. So yeah, there's submission and agreement with people who are taking the lead in a fine way. That's not what Ignatius is talking about. And he's actually using terms that Paul uses and saying we shouldn't do it, that Paul does do. To me, that's the complete transformation of disposition on the part of the Christians around this time.
Yeah, it is really significant. I mean, on the one hand, I think it actually would be possible. I mean, I wouldn't put it past the historical Ignatius. He could have written this and maybe used it as a pull for power for himself and other bishops at his time.
He could have.
But definitely plausible and could very easily happen. Also, it could be by later people who actually corrupted the text and wanted to use Ignatius to put forward this when they're later trying to control people, because honestly, I wouldn't put it past that of it being, put on the lips or on, at the pen of Ignatius later on, where, people are corrupting Ignatius to try to control people later on and saying, see, look what Ignatius said. I'm not claiming that that's at all definitive, but it's definitely, I think, possible and not out of the realm of possibility, given the fact that, very little can be said about what we can truly trust is actually the historical Ignatius actually saying here.
That is very true. In fact, it deserves emphasizing because the fact is, this is probably the most interpolated teaching throughout all of his letters. This gross elevation of the bishop, as you even see right here coming up in Ephesians 3:2. Mm-hmm. So the fact is, the two main traditions that are used as authoritative today, the Syriac and Greek Middle Recension, they're the ones telling us someone is lying. Someone's making stuff up. And guess what? One of those stuffs that's being made up is in large part, if not largest part, this right here, because in the Syriac tradition, like I mentioned earlier, there's one or two that we'll read later that kind of talk like this. Mm-hmm. In the Greek Middle Recension that everyone accepts pretty much, there's probably 10 or more, right? I think I've cited here probably between 6 and 10, but there's probably 10 or more that openly, some more subtly, they could go either way, kind of like New Testament just being, but in the context of his overall thought, right? Pretty much, he has to be saying the same thing most of the time, even if it doesn't come out as descriptively with as many words, right? It's not like saying it should be soft like the New Testament, submission to those taking the lead in the right way versus hard and fast, whereas if you don't submit to the bishop, you're basically dead, right? Is essentially what he says. You don't have a church, nothing.
Yeah. And this is in Ephesians 3:2, Greg. This is a very important passage. I want you to come on here. He says, but since love doth not suffer me to be silent concerning you, therefore was I forward to exhort you that ye run in harmony with the mind of God, for Jesus Christ also, our inseparable life, is the mind of the Father, which is the point you were making before about the modalism aspect. And then it's like a double whammy, this passage, even as the bishops that are settled in the farthest parts of the earth are in the mind of Jesus Christ, right? So it's elevating, first of all, it's elevating Christ to such a level that he's almost seeming like, as you're saying, the mind of God, or the mind of the Father, that you see that modalism that you were mentioning earlier coming in here, and then it's elevating the bishops almost to that same status, right?
It is, and this is actually one of the more mild ones, but it not to take away from it. First, on the modalism, to me, this is probably, I'll say, the most compelling verse, and the reason why is it says both things. It refers to Jesus as the mind of God, and the mind of the Father. So unless we're going to posit that there's a difference here, that there's actually a mind of the Father, and then there's this mind of God, that Jesus is the mind, there's some kind of intermodalism within that mind. I don't know. To me, the equation of the two here seems evident, right? You have te, gnome, tu, theu, and then you have Jesus Christos, tu patros he nome, right? So you have nome for the mind, used both for the Father and God, tu theu, tu patros. And then with the bishops, though, it's different. That last red part in the English and Greek, he doesn't equate them the way he does the mind of Jesus and the Father. He says, we're in the mind of Jesus, which elsewhere he speaks of as the mind of the Father. So it kind of relents to the same position, although I do grant your earlier points. I see those as valid. But this is kind of my compelling evidence. And I see a difference here, but yet an elevation nonetheless of the bishops, almost to the status of where Jesus, they're in his mind, right? Who's going to argue with the mind of Jesus, which is effectively the mind of the Father, right? So this is where I get my modalism. But nonetheless, and it kind of carries over to the whole economy he lays out, right? Bishop, deacons, presbyters, but they all are of the same mind. It says right here, the bishops at least are in the farthest parts of the earth in the mind of Jesus. So whether, there may be a way that this whole mind thing with Jesus could be viewed similarly, I see the wording is differently with the bishops, but I don't discount it as an option.
Mm-hmm.
Nonetheless, I see this as compelling modalism for Jesus and the Father, and I see it as compelling evidence for elevation of the bishops to the level of Jesus, i.e. the Father. And so, inappropriate, who's going to resist that? Who's going to submit to that, right? Would Paul do that? No. So I see the conditions being created here that aren't in the New Testament and that lead to this further abuse of doctrine and hierarchy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. I mean, there are more passages on this. I don't know if there's any other passage you want to
Go up real quickly, that one. It doesn't seem significant, but right there. So we have a text from Pliny where he writes to Trajan about how he says the Christians sing to Jesus as to a god, which they often mistranslate as God, even though the Romans wouldn't have believed it that way. Either way. So I want people to just know from this that around the same time, right? Because that was in the early 2nd century. This is early 2nd century. When Pliny writes like that, it's not necessarily that they're singing directly to Jesus as if a god, but more likely along the lines of what you're seeing here, singing to the Father through Jesus. And Pliny just doesn't understand that. So I wanted to qualify a little because the time is very similar to that letter to Trajan. And you have the idea of singing. There's a few things that he kind of describes them saying they do, but it doesn't mean you necessarily got it right and limiting it only to Jesus. I think there's just writing that because it was Jesus being talked about, but in the doctrinal view of the time, even in Ignatius, it's to the Father through Jesus. So it's something to keep in mind. In 6:1 here, you can see that's important in respect to what I said earlier about the word from silence. So right there, a man seeth that his bishop is silent. Let him fear the more. Okay, why is that? Well, because he says God was silent before he spoke the word, and he parallels the bishop with God the Father. He says he's a type of the Father. So he's saying that bishop here, when you see the bishop silent, you should be afraid because God the Father in his silence spoke the word. And even says at the end of 6:1 that you should regard the bishop as the Lord himself. So that together with this whole fear, this is not the most significant. This is another piece, but that in the overall is building up this case for him to say, hey, submit to the bishop, don't resist the bishop, versus what we see with Paul and others. Now, I don't know what happened. It looks like part of your thing got cut off.
Oh yeah. Sorry about that.
That's okay. We reviewed 7:2, right? That whole, this is non-Trinitarian for sure, but it's potential different views like we talked about. So I just note here that we're considered stones of a temple being prepared as the building of God the Father. That'll play into a later text. We can scroll down. Ephesians 15:3. We see the Lord, even a secret's hid unto him. Let us therefore do all things as knowing that he dwelleth in us, to the end that we may be his temples, and he himself may be in us as our God. Okay, so if you scroll up just to include that prior verse that I just read, I said it'd be significant in a moment. There. Right, so we see the temple referred to there in Ephesians 9:1, the temple building of God the Father, but it's referred to later in Ephesians with respect to the one who dwells in us, his temple, he may be in us as our God. Okay, so this is where I see this whole Jesus as our God significant, what it means. That in my view of the modalism of Ignatius, but not fully discounting other views of subordinationism, like we talked about, the Father is in him as their God. It's the Father building them as stones for the temple that he's going to inhabit. So I get that from 9:1, and it's elsewhere too, but it goes from 9:1 to 15:3. Father's building stones of a temple that he refers to in 15:3 as the Lord inhabiting as our God. So I see that as the Father, or Jesus as the mind of the Father, and in that sense, he is their God. It's not Trinitarian, and it's not New Testament. It's closer to New Testament in the sense that it's representational, kind of, right? Like Jesus is our God in the sense that he's the Father to Ignatius, in my view, or to us, he only does, he's the image of the Father, right? He's the only image that we can acknowledge in that kind of devotional way without blaspheming. So we don't see him as a second of the original. We see him as the image of the original. And so therefore there is only the original and the image. But so in Ignatius, though, I think it's more condensed, and I see that he believes Jesus is more as the mind of the Father and therefore God in him. So that's important, I think, just in the maybe as the Muslim apologists are thinking of how to deal with Trinitarians who abuse this, and Christians as well. You need to kind of conceptualize how Ignatius may be understanding Jesus as our God. Okay. I think that is because he's the mind of the Father in us. And I think he identifies him as the Father in these ways, building the temple, dwelling in us as our God in a semi-modalist, if not pure modalistic view. But it's definitely not Trinitarian when he's referred to as our God. It's in some sense him as the Father, or in some sense subordinate to the Father, but living in us as our God. If you see it that way.
Yeah.
And then it says 15:1, better to keep silence and to be than to talk and not be. So you look at the purple part. Let's see what I highlighted here. So you have, when you were talking about silence, again, this comes up later. So we have a contrast between silence and talking and existing in both cases. So in here, Ephesians 1, the subject is existing in both cases, really alive, but silent and talking are the two contrasts. So then in 15:2, he says, through his speech, he may act, and through his silence, he's known. We have this, again, development of silence versus speaking, acting versus existing as being made known. This plays into what we talked about earlier with the word being spoken from silence, but that'll come up again. And that, I think relates more to the Arian controversy because of that whole thing. In fact, they changed that reading to say the word spoken from silence. Several texts say the eternal word, aidios, not uk, spoken from silence. So they understood very clearly what the implications were. Lightfoot and others have shown that's not a viable reading, he being a Trinitarian, of course, and used most often. So that should dispel Trinitarians' attempt to try to make use of that. But they actually tried to change it, right? Big surprise, changing Ignatius after it's already been changed who knows how many times. But whatever you need to do for the Trinity, I guess, for some people. Yeah. So that's going to play in more, though, but it directly relates to that if it doesn't come up again. This whole difference between silent and speaking. And this relates to the whole issue of time and how I see the word as being spoken, i.e. created in the invisible, non-physical time sense by the Father to assume that mode in order to create new other things before becoming the Son, etc. But you can also see it subordination in a subordinationist sense, that he's spoken, he happens, because that's different from the silence as we just read. And so therefore he is not sequentially as old as the Father who spoke him.
Right.
Let's see. So this again, I think also lends to modalism. Ephesians 18:2, for our God, Jesus the Christ, was conceived in the womb by Mary. That kind of language, right? Even though we do have text in the Bible that Trinitarians knows might point to Emmanuel, God with us, that is not the same. And that's explained in other texts like John 14. The Father's the one in Jesus doing and saying all these things. He makes that clear. So what about Mary? Well, our God, to me, you can see the whole incarnation there, of course, and see it in that light, as Trinitarians do. But in light of the overall understanding of Ignatius, with Jesus as the mind of the Father who builds the temple that he inhabits as our God, I think this is a modalistic reference with Jesus as our God, but because the Father, he's the Father's mind essentially, but in other ways as well, like we talked about earlier with him inhabiting the temple. But if you just see it as him as the mind of the Father, I think that might be the easiest way to understand my view and explain to Trinitarians, this isn't the same as Trinity. Okay, these are God references. Establish that one text with him as the mind of the will of the Father or both. Then from there, you can decide how further you want to go with either subordinationism or modalism. But you've at least shown, hey, he's not talking about Trinity here. No, he's not talking about Jesus as a person of a triune God and the Father is a separate person of a triune God. He's saying he's the mind of the Father, and in that sense, he's their God. But if you look at Magnesians 2:1, then he says, he refers to a deacon, and then he says, of whom I would fain to have joy, for that he is subject to the bishop as unto the grace of God, and to the presbytery as unto the law of Jesus Christ. Okay, so we have two of the most, like, you can't, you're not supposed to resist or fail to submit to the grace of God, which is an actual power in the Orthodox view, or the law of Christ, right? Who's not going to submit to that? Who's going to resist the law of Jesus and the grace of God? Well, nobody. But when you say that the bishop is as the grace, and we're to subject to the bishop as to the grace, and the presbytery as to the law of Jesus, well, who needs the Bible then, right? Yeah. We get grace and we get law from the bishop and the presbytery, and that is exactly what we see today and saw for a long time. They didn't give people the Bible, right? They didn't. That's not the case back during this time, or for a long time. This is exactly what you had. The bishop was the one who gave you the grace, and the presbytery the law, and of course the deacons and everybody else in the hierarchy, everything you needed, the sacraments, so that you could have a relationship with God. It's the same thing we see going with the ortho-pagans and the Protestants today. Look at 7:1, Magnesium
7:1, yeah, it goes perfectly along with that. Go ahead.
Yeah, it does. As the Lord did nothing without the Father, being united in him. It's in brackets, but there actually are Greek words to that effect in the text, either by himself or by the apostles. So he's saying the Lord did absolutely nothing. It's similar to John 5. Of course, we know the Trinitarians often say, well, they did it all at the same time, which is not what John 5 says. He literally says he sees the Father, and then he does what he saw him do, right? So there is no, they all did it together. No, there's actually someone doing something and someone seeing something and then doing something likewise, homoios. Yeah. Homoios. So, and then he says, Lord did nothing without the Father. We kind of talked about that on Trinity, but on the bishop part, neither do ye anything. So he sets that up again. That's the comparison always throughout this on the bishop elevation. Jesus, the Father, and the counsel of God. Neither do ye anything without the bishop and the presbyters, and attempt not to think anything right for yourselves apart from others. Okay, so yeah, in the New Testament, we are told to be one. We're told to think in agreement, but we're not told to all think as the bishop or the presbyters. We're told to think on what is written. And if
it's not a blind submission.
Right. It's not subject to what other people keep telling us. In fact, Paul even says, you guys keep dividing between me, Apollos, Cephas. Don't do that. That's essentially what he's promoting right here, but under the guise of being united. So it's not united over what they all agree on. We're all united over what the bishop and the presbyters tell us. We don't even think anything. Okay. This is getting into your mind now. Relates to certain modern day cults, even, I would say, but you don't do anything, right? It's not just, you don't marry apart from the bishop, which they say as well, but anything. This is very broad. And he prefaces it with a reminder of Jesus and the Father, right? So throughout there is this idea and view presented that, look, if you disagree with the bishop, he even says this later, you're following the devil. You're latruoing the devil. Like Sam, you're a tool of the devil, Sam. He says you're a tool of the devil if you don't submit to the bishop.
Yeah, and the thing too, Greg, is that some of the, and I'm not trying to like beat up on Dr. White or anything, but whatever, he throws himself into the mix, so it is what it is. He will misrepresent somebody like Ignatius, right? But then he can't accept this passage from Magnesium 7:1. The Protestants, I mean, as a broad perspective, for the most part, they would not want to accept this. Sola Scriptura Protestants, this does not fit with their ideology. So you see, they want to use Ignatius to their own devices when it suits their Trinitarian later pagan, theology. But then they also want to throw Ignatius on the bus, or just, hey, they don't tell they don't, when they present Ignatius on the Trinity, they don't present this passage, right?
Right. No, they they wouldn't agree with probably a lot of what he teaches, including God, if it was thoroughly understood. He also says if you boast, you're basically dead. So Sam can't cite him. He says you can't marry without the bishop, and you can't marry out of lust. Once again, disqualifies Sam, right? He's pure lust. Talks about it all the time. Can't handle it. He's trying to get married to curb his lust. Ignatius says you can't get married if that's why you're getting married, Sam. So you not only don't follow him on God, maybe you follow him on the bishop, but that's the tool of the devil part. But you get Sam, no boasting, no lusting for marriage. It's over. But he'll still run to him for Trinitarian texts, all while he's living in a way that is almost 100% opposed to how Ignatius, is said to have taught and lived.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I didn't mean to derail, but I just thought that was significant because it just demonstrates the inconsistency in these guys and how they use these sources.
Hypocrites.
Yeah.
In many cases, it's outrank hypocrisy. So Magnificent 7:2, right? Just get to the temple again. We were talking about earlier how the Father had a building made of stones in his temple and inhabited us as our God. Hasten to come together, all of you, as to one temple, even God, as to one altar, even one Jesus Christ, who came forth from one Father and is with one and departed to one. Okay, so I would see this also as furthering my whole understanding of Jesus as the Father in the temple that is us, that the Father builds. And even, so it says one temple, even God. So that right there, I think suggests more modalism, but then it says as to one altar, even Jesus. So I would see that as a mode, who came forth from the Father, same thing as earlier, and we talked about with the word being spoken. That's the same thing, who came forth from the Father, I would see as the Father speaking to him. And then it says, and is with one and departed unto one. Now, the translation at the end, departed unto one, it just says, and departed, right? Koroi Santa. But before that, it says, he is with one. He came forth from one and is with one. Kai, Ais, Ena, Onta. So he's with one. He's talking about presently. He came forth from him and he's with one. He departed unto one. He goes on to kind of explain how he's with him. He departed unto him. Okay, so if he's with one and it's explicitly talking about the Father, there is no way he could be thinking of a Trinity here, right? Because he's only with one. There's no Holy Spirit. And regardless of how you see him in the relationship of the Father, this would have been a perfect time to just say he's with the Father. This isn't a hard thing to add in your description of your theology if it's what you really believe. To say here that we think he should not have limited the persons he's with to one, if you believe he believed in a Trinity, is not being unreasonable. It's not arguing from silence. It's saying what he's actually saying limits it to one, which, yes, consequentially defeats the idea he's with two.
Yeah, no, I agree with that 100%.
And then 8:2 says one God, right? He says there's one God who manifested himself through Jesus Christ, his Son.
That's the passage you were talking about earlier, right? The proceeding from silence.
Right. So we don't have to spend a lot of time there, but essentially, again, this was changed in a couple of texts to say, and his eternal word, who did not proceed from silence. That's how badly it bothered people. The notes on this in Schodel's edition, and he gives you the text. And in Trallian's 2:1, it says, when ye are obedient to the bishop as to Jesus, it is evident to me you're living not after men, but after Jesus. Okay, so his test for orthodoxy or whether you're living as a Christian isn't whether you're following Jesus or whether you're living the golden rule of the law of Jesus. No, it's whether you're obedient to the bishop, right? So that will tell him. That's the only thing he needs to know, and that's exactly what we see today. This is a criticism they make of Sam a lot, right? They'll still use him and not care, but they'll ultimately say when push comes to shove, you don't submit to the bishop, right?
Right.
So this is not really any different at all. This is their tradition. It's the most, if not one of the most, if not the most interpolated idea and teaching in the Ignatian corpus, that of the bishop elevation in this manner and worse. And it is exactly the people we see operating in this way today. So the fact that his texts are not usable also tell us that, we don't have the full story going on with this guy, and we certainly are not going to rely on him when it comes to God or the bishop if it doesn't agree with the sources, and with so much interpolation conflicting among the traditions, right? So a lot of these texts are not in the Syriac. Trallian's is not even in the Syriac tradition. So you essentially have later Syriac Christians in their tradition saying Eusebius is lying. Eusebius he's got 4 letters that aren't even real, right? What if you had like someone like me saying that an earlier Christian is using 4 letters of the New Testament that aren't in the New Testament? That's a massive difference. Right? It's like kind of what we argue with them today in different ways. That's what they're saying. They're saying that the Greek, at their time, of course, the longer tradition was more prevalent. So you would have had up to 17 down to what they considered the 3 only. But even before that, in the most used middle recension, over half is different. We're saying Eusebius's tradition is that corrupt if you go with the Syriac. And if you go with the Syriac, or you go with Eusebius, not Syriac, you're saying the Syriac is that corrupt. Either way, the Greek middle tradition or the Syriac tradition are so corrupt from either's disposition. Exactly how are we supposed to have confidence in what to use? Maybe just by cross comparing the text and coming up with the only agreeable readings across all variations. That'd be the only way you could get some kind of believable tradition, but then you're using texts that you're assembling that aren't actually a whole document related to that tradition, right? So it's just beyond recovery, really, at this point, absent a significant find.
Right.
But you have
I just grabbed this. I just wanted to show people, for anyone who wants to buy it or interested. This is a Shodel text.
He covers a lot of stuff. Covers the main positions, including Ruiz Campos, which I favor, but which isn't the only one.
Yeah, but this is I recommend this. This is a good read. This is called Ignatius of Antioch by William R. Shodel. So I recommend it. I cited it, I think, a number of times in my book. But anyway, just because you mentioned it and I had it right there, so I figured I'd show anybody who's interested. But yeah, I think it's a good text. Let's go down here a little bit. So we dealt with those. We got Trallian's 3:1 here. In like manner, let all men respect the deacons as Jesus Christ, even as they should respect the bishop as being a type of the Father, and the presbyters as the council of God and as the college of apostles. Apart from these, there is not even the name of a church. I mean, that's a really shocking one, man.
I know I get a little carried away. I was looking at this text and thinking, why am I reading pretty much the whole thing? That doesn't seem right.
It's the whole thing, dude.
It's going over and thinking there's not, I would confuse people if I just read it a word or two here or there, because the whole thing is out of control, right? So very clearly here, we get the most profound, one of the most profound elevations beyond anything New Testament related of the bishop and the presbytery that you'll find in Ignatius, right? So the deacons are as Jesus. All men are to respect them as such. So forget Paul and Peter and forget the whole Revelation 2 Ephesian Christian mess. That wouldn't apply here. I don't see how. Even as they, right, the deacons should respect the bishop as being a type of the Father, right? Onta typon tu patros. A type of the Father, right? Right. What man could you think of that you would characterize that way, except maybe an inspired prophet or someone like Jesus, right? To elevate a human being, a fallible human being, and say, well, this is a type of God. This human I will respect as if he is God. And I'm not talking about just in the general sense, which is true of every Christian according to the New Testament, that he who receives you receives me. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about a general elevation among Christians. So it would be above that just quoted teaching of Jesus among all. Or the deacons are Jesus now. This blows 1 Corinthians 11:3 in headship from the woman to God out of the water. No, the deacons will respect them as Jesus. The bishop is the type of the Father, the one God, and the presbyters are like the council of God or the college of the apostles, right? So the elders are like, I guess, the sons of God in Psalm 82 or something like the gods, the council of gods, or the apostles. Either way, we're superhuman or inspired on all levels of the church hierarchy at this time, completely inconsistent with the New Testament and with Clement, right? He doesn't make these kinds of distinctions between these terms, nor elevate the individuals in this manner. So this to me is just, it's clear either, as you said earlier, which I also believe is possible, that this is a either later interpolation or a later wholesale fabrication of text attached to the name of a likely existing martyr whose story was compelling enough to do so, through whom they then aligned everybody with people structurally so that they could monetize and have power and control over them, exactly like Paul said they would, treat them, be oppressive wolves, and continued to develop all the way through to Constantine, where you have the very same thing, only on a massive scale. And everything is different now, right, than it used to be, in terms of churches, in terms of money. So things progressively change, but they were either at work very early in people like Ignatius, or the kinds of interpolations we see different from the Syriac and Greek tradition, which are often these, and this is one of them, because Tralines isn't in the Syriac. These were written and added to the tradition that was accepted by Eusebius in the 4th century and used to keep people under control or establish the tradition that was being used and legitimize it.
Yeah. This one,
that's a mind.
I've read it before, but when I was just reading it now, I'm like, wow, this really blows them out, man. Yeah, we've got more here.
Yeah, it's a minor one, but probably, so I try to do a few things that would give you kind of a context of thought, be inseparable from God or Jesus Christ, and from the bishop and the order. Yeah. So here you have, to me, even though it's not as descriptive as the prior one, this is very 1 Corinthians 11:3, right? It's not Jesus and God are above man. It's we're to be inseparable from Jesus and from the bishop and from the apostles, right? So the bishop gets put in the middle and even before the apostles here. 7:2, he that doeth aught without the bishop and the Presbyterian deacons, this man is not clean in his conscience. So again, this kind of psychological training for people that we see active in cults today, that you do anything apart from this group or this person, you're clean, you're not clean, right? So
yeah, and this is condemning Sam, because virtually everything he does is without a bishop, right? I mean, he says he's too fat to put on pants and go and get communion and give confession to his Catholic priest or whatever. And he's doing everything apart from it, and I'm not just saying this on him. He's basically admitted it. He's got a problem with food and masturbation. So, I mean, I don't think the bishops would be supporting that, although, I don't know, the Catholic priests maybe.
I hate to say it, I don't know. See, there's a connection between Sam's eating and his self-abuse. So I don't know. I don't know if he thinks he'll lose control at the Eucharist or not. It's despicable. But I think maybe if he thinks he goes to church, he's going to have to run to the bathroom or something. It's terrible. Sam, shame on you for making us think about you in the ways that are true, but grotesque.
Greg, he has said it himself, right? We didn't put
it on. This is all him. We're not making this up. This is
from him himself. I mean, every time he does a live stream, even when he says he's talking about me and Greg, he has to make these prayers about having to avoid lustful impurities, right?
24/7, and then he of course attack us in the worst.
And then after he's done with the live stream, he's probably on some porn website or something. It's just
something's
crazy.
Going on there, because he's out of control, and all he has to do is eat, and it's triggered.
Yeah, it's just
no
crazy.
Way. He can't function in normal society, probably. But somehow he's able to ignore all of this in Ignatius and focus on the Trinity, which isn't even right. I think he's been traumatized, and of course I've known him a long time. Sam's crazy. And he's not, this is not new, everybody, just so you know. Most of you probably know. I've known Sam since the late 80s. He was worse. Okay, he would interrupt, he would call it. He's a crazy person. He was always a stalker. He would always attack you viciously, and people he didn't know, but that you knew. So none of this is new. The Protestants really started him. Now, they may not have anticipated this, but still, fact is, they encouraged him during probably his worst period for a long time. So it's important we highlight that. Sam is still used, like you said. He's in one sense a joke, but in another sense, he's not a joke. And if you don't take him seriously, even if you see the parts of him that are a joke, I think you'll regret it, because he's that committed to false doctrine and lying. So you don't want to sleep on Sam. He's too committed to making you look bad and promoting lies. So it's kind of weird, but don't forget it.
And we're not slandering him, Greg. I just want to repeat this because this is something he has admitted on his own YouTube channel. He almost does it daily.
Right.
He's got this problem with lustful impurities, and he's explicitly mentioned masturbating and these kind. We are not slandering him just because we don't like him. He is actually saying, he's confessing this to his own audience.
And he'll bring it up. He'll describe all the stuff that's not appropriate, but he's already done it. And then, so it's either, it's a very complicated matter to deal with Sam on some levels. But when people hear us describing him in these ways, there's no other way to do it. We can lie and then be liars, but nice. But we're just being nice to a liar for no reason who defames God on a daily basis. So I don't see a reason for that. And saying the truth is biblical, even when it's harsh, as is often the case. And I don't expect perfection from me or Sam or anybody else. So the fact is, though, you need to have context when you hear me or Jake or anyone talk about Sam. It's just a little too complicated to understand on its face,
Yeah, exactly. Then this we got going down to Philadelphians.
So it continues on. The whole blood of Jesus thing, again, that relates ultimately to modalism. Acts 20:28 is not the correct reading textually and even idiomatically, with hagios is often used as for a relative of the subject. And so we can get off on that, but it's not supportive of that, and it's not even the same meaning. But again, we get the mind of Jesus and then his Holy Spirit there on Philadelphians. There aren't many Holy Spirit references in Ignatius, but where it is referenced, it's Jesus' Holy Spirit. So, and then Philadelphians 3:2, as many as are of God and of Jesus, they are with the bishop. Once again, this spiritual conditioning, not after Jesus and God or the truth, but after the bishop, the deacons, the presbyters, people who could be telling you anything, especially if you don't verify it by what's written. So Philadelphians 7:1, we're coming up to that. This is wild. I'd like to hear what you think about this, Jake. He says, for there are certain persons desired to deceive me after the flesh, yet the spirit is not deceived, right? So he's the subject, being from God. He has the spirit. For it knoweth whence it cometh and where it goeth. So he can't be deceived like they're trying to do. And it searcheth out the hidden things. I cried out when I was among you. I spoke with a loud voice, with God's own voice.
Oh, man.
Give ye heed to the bishop and the presbytery and the deacons. So it's not just this overly elevated reference occasionally in one or more of the traditions that is bothering us. There are, and it's not even paralleling him with the one God the Father, and as we read earlier, all the things that were inappropriate. He's literally saying people are trying to deceive him, but he has the Spirit, and that Spirit is making him cry out when he was among them, right? So he's referring to events that they can relate to where he spoke with God's voice, claiming inspiration, right? How else can we interpret this, especially in this context? And what does he tell them? Follow Jesus or treat people with the love? No. Give ye heed to, that's the primary thing here, either in his writings authentically or, like we've been suggesting is very possibly the case, someone else has an ulterior motive here for using this guy and for injecting in him not only theological error, but ecclesiastical insanity, right? So this is really, to me, either the reason, if original or original enough to give rise to all this stuff, It's either the reason or it's the consequence, right? The consequence meaning that the rising of what I call the dragon church or pagan Christianity led to these kind of interpolations and redactions that were attempts at self-legitimization, using earlier figures in ways that were never meant, that they never wrote or thought about, which we see if we just compare the Syriac and Greek for sure. And we still ultimately don't know how bad it is.
Yeah. Yeah, no, this is just crazy. Imagine, trying to invite someone to Christianity, and this is something that you tell them, right?
Right.
Like, who the hell would accept that and just be like, "Oh yeah, this is great." I mean,
it ultimately is what they're telling them, right? They're telling them that if they don't accept these councils and these earlier bishops and their modern bishops, they can't be. So effectively, they are saying the same thing, just not as blatantly,
Right.
And so Philippians 7:2, howbeit those who are suspected me. So he's talking about people who suspected him of saying what we just read,
right?
Because he knows beforehand the division of certain persons. So he's trying to get all these people in God's voice to follow the bishop, and then they're suspecting him, and he's saying he knew beforehand they were causing division. But then he says, but he in whom I am bound is my witness, that I learned it not from flesh and man. It was the preaching of the Spirit who spoke on the wise. Do nothing without the bishop. Once again, he's claiming inspiration. Openly preaching of it wasn't him. He didn't learn it from humans like Paul. It's basically Galatians 1. Preaching what the Spirit told him. He's not Paul. He even says that too. It's so weird. So the Spirit is speaking to him and telling him Jesus is the Messiah or Jesus is a prophet. No, don't do anything without the bishop, right? Submit to the bishop. This is what God's voice, I'm going to tell you in a loud voice. These people suspecting me, trying to deceive me. I spoke with an inspired voice and told them, submit to the bishop and don't do anything without him. That's what he's saying right here. And then
it's like he's kind of actually claiming divine inspiration in that sense. I mean,
I really don't think it can be that. He's saying
he's elevating himself to the level of, from a Christian paradigm, apostles and the divine inspiration that they receive. That's what he seems like he's saying.
It says it's not from flesh or man. So who could it be from? And then he identifies the Spirit. And he previously he spoke with God's voice with the Spirit. And it's telling him things that aren't in what we would consider potentially or actually inspired. So
right. Yeah, exactly.
You take that and you go further in Philadelphians to 8:2, right? We're reading from 7. These aren't long chapters, by the way. They're like 1 or 2 or 3 verses. He says, I entreat you, talking to the same people, do nothing in a spirit of division, factitiousness, but after the teaching of Christ. Okay. But then he says, I heard certain people saying, if I find it not in the charters, which is the Greek term tois archaios, which means the archives, right? Archaion can mean a public place or a depository, but in the plural, it usually refers to archives or written records, which is proven by the context here because it goes on. He says, I heard certain people saying, if I don't find it in the archives, I don't believe it's in the gospel. When I said to them, it is written. So again, that to me proves the subject is what's written, not a place, what the records. They answered me, that's the question. Okay.
Yeah. In other words, they're disputing that. They're saying, yeah, well, show me it.
We got a dialogue Ignatius is relating here between him and people who are trying to deceive him, whom he's saying submit to the bishop with God's voice and by the Spirit, not by man or flesh. He's saying they're being divisive because he's heard certain people saying, if it's not written in the archives, I don't believe it's in the gospel. Gospel also shows they're not just talking about the Old Testament, right? It says,
this is mainly
so they're clearly talking about what they're supposed to believe as gospel, right? That maybe you could say that if it's not anything of the apostles or gospel narratives and it's only Old Testament records, that still has to be records that they then apply to Jesus in ways that become the gospel. But I think it's even more than that because, he's talking about what they believe as gospel. The apostles have already been there as Jesus. To suggest they don't have anything written about that and those events they were told to carry on is unlikely, but it wouldn't matter ultimately because Ignatius is saying, I don't care what's in those. My archive, he goes on in the same verse, not in red, is Jesus Christ and his cross and death and resurrection. Okay, so it's a cop-out. He's just saying the very things that the people he's talking to would use the records to verify, or what he's saying does not provide an answer to the question.
He doesn't give any evidence. He doesn't say, here's where it is. And it's just going back to this idea of him being the bishop. Exactly. Trust me, bro, type of thing. Trust me,
hey, don't do anything. Don't resist. It gets even worse, actually, as you're going to see. But he's actually arguing with the people I identify with as of the same Christian mind that say, hey, we go based on the best evidence, what's written, the Old Testament text related to Jesus, the prophets, and all that, but that also are found among the earliest Christians that we can use to verify what he did and taught from their perspective. So he's arguing with people over written records to solve this problem for sure. And his what he's relying on is not something that resolves the dispute. It's just a circular argument, going back to his whole speaking with God's voice and with God's spirit and saying submit to the bishop. That's the context of this discussion. Same Philadelphians. And there's not a lot of verses separating that, if any. It goes really from 1, 2, 3, right to the next one in most cases.
Yeah. It's all, we're not taking it out of context. It's all together. Then you've got another letter here, the Smyrnans, chapter 8.
1, right? So do ye all follow your bishop as Jesus followed the Father. This is somewhat subordinationist, of course, supportive. And the presbytery as the apostles. So once again, just dealing with the hierarchical issues. The
thing is, Greg, on the one hand, it, in a normal person's mind, it could seem like subordinationism, right? Because the bishop is not supposed to be at the same level as Christ and the Father. But the problem is, based upon Ignatius's other texts, he's already elevated them, right, to such a level that it's like they're kind of all at the same level anyway. So
if you just read this verse, you wouldn't think modalism at all. But understanding what he means by Jesus Christ, i.e. the mind of the Father, that changes this verse, at least to me. But I do understand that aspect of it. It's just the totality is hard to ignore, or at least to say, no, clearly he has not even an incipient Trinitarianism, and certainly not a developed Trinitarianism.
We could actually, what it could be, Greg, and that's why I don't really take a hard and fast position on it in my chapter on Ignatius, because really because Ignatius was, I believe, textually corrupted to such a degree, you could actually, it's not necessary to say that all of Ignatius is telling one story, right? You could have different threads that are competing with one another. Maybe he initially was more kind of subordinationist, and then you have this later people putting all the time Christ is being called our God and elevating him to the level of Father in line with the elevation of the bishops, right? So you could have competing kind of themes within Ignatius that are indicative of textual corruption from different folks. I don't know. I think that's
the point. That's a very
so
not just additions either, but which we see all over the place, but minuses, right? So unless we would say the Syriac text is most probably a translation, unless you're going to argue for a Syriac original, but it's dated to the 6th to 9th, and it doesn't contain, as you're going to see, anywhere near the kind of theological descriptions that the Greek recension has. So if that's not original, if the Syriac is after the Greek middle recension originals, then someone cut out whole letters, right? Not just text. I mean, the whole letters were destroyed, which wouldn't have a place in light of origin. But nonetheless, it's significant. Like I said, over 50% of the middle recension letters are gone in the Syriac recension, including Smyrnans.
Right. And the thing with us, Greg, is that we are not hell-bent on having Ignatius say one particular thing, right? So we don't have to argue that all of, the different recensions or the middle recension, even that in all texts Ignatius has the same theology and he's basically always saying the same thing. We don't have to do that because we're not trying to shoehorn him into our own theology or into a Trinitarian thought to make him fit this same narrative of saying the same thing all the time. That's why in my chapter in the book, I don't try to do that. I don't try to say that, from what we possess today of Ignatius is necessarily one consistent theology throughout the writings. I don't have to say that. I don't have to argue for that because I'm not claiming he was this, as other Trinitarians like Sam want to do. They have to do that. They're the ones with the problem. They have to now tell us when there are these seemingly conflicting theologies within Ignatius. They're the ones have to make sense of all of it and do that. We don't really necessarily have to do that.
No, that's an outstanding point. And in fact, so while I lean in the pure modalistic direction, as I said earlier, I absolutely see the subordinationism that's not modalistic in Ignatius, and probably the way you just described it as resulting from divergent traditions and interpolations or minuses is probably the best way to look at that versus trying to synthesize every single thing into one consistent theology.
Yeah, we're not required to, because we're not saying Ignatius had the same beliefs as us, the historical one or the one that's represented in the record. We're not beholden to that. We're not forced to actually do that. That's for Sam and these other,
they try to do that, right? Yeah,
exactly. They need to do that, and when they do, they just embarrass themselves, right?
They wouldn't admit, like you and I just did. Like we may have our view overall of Ignatius, but we can admit, hey, he also says these things, and these might actually be a different tradition. They can't do that.
Right.
They can't acknowledge these kinds of flaws, which are obvious.
Right. Greg, just sidebar, somebody posted here in the chat, said, can you make this PDF available for download? I just want to let people know this is Greg who put this together, so that would be up to him. I personally don't have any problem with it, but that's up to you, Greg.
Yeah. So what I gave to you, you're free to give to others. That has like a little part where it's just for you. I say, after the intro, jump to the bottom.
Right. Yeah. I would delete any of that kind of stuff.
That was prepared for the purpose of scrolling as needed. So you're free to share that to anyone you want. And if anyone who wants a copy of what Jake is showing you right here, you can email me or comment on my video somewhere, and I will be happy to send it to you. I'll have more coming out Ignatius later, but I would get Jake's book. There's a ton obviously going on in there, and I'm going to need probably another 4 to 5 months, so closer to the end of the year. But I would get Jake's book, and you got these videos.
Greg, you're working on
more's coming.
You're working on something on Philo, right?
Yeah, but I'm also I have a paper I'm going to put together on Ignatius. I'll make available on the site. So it'll be for sure a paper with all these readings and my commentary and textual analysis and stuff. So try to
be on the lookout for the Philo thing, and I think that's very important. Obviously, my book is I'm trying to deal with like 400 years of history in one book, so it's condensed. So obviously, Greg's book that's specifically on Philo is going to go into a lot more detail and things like that, although we probably, for the most part, have the same kind of view overall. But I want to state that from the outset. And even with Ignatius, like a lot of this textual tradition stuff, I'm aware of it. I kind of let the reader know some of the stuff going on, but I don't go into it in so much detail because literally you could write a whole book just on Ignatius as well. You know what I mean? And I'm not able to do that. I try to condense things. I think my book's going to be around 500 pages as is. And I tried not to go into, detail that was not necessary for what my project was. So yeah, I think Philo is such an important figure. That's why I deal with him in my book as well, even though he's not technically a Christian. The Christian Trinitarians try to abuse him. In fact, Greg and I already dealt with that in the past in a previous stream that we did in reference to Justin Martyr, because they brought on this guy, Father Kappas, which I'm not going to put him in the same class as William and Sam, but nevertheless, I think he's educated enough. So I would say that he's kind of being dishonest in certain senses to say that Philo and Justin are Trinitarians basically in the same way as 4th century Nicene Trinitarians, just slightly different terminology. For anyone who's actually read the primary and secondary sources of genuine modern Christian scholars who just admit the fact that they're not, is just so far from the truth that I just can't take you seriously. I mean, I like to give you the excuse of ignorance, but somebody like Father Kappas and these other people who are familiar with the primary sources, or go and read Greg's book on Philo when it comes out, God willing, you just read Philo, dude, and you see this guy is not a Trinitarian at all. I mean, what are you talking about? And this 2 powers in heaven Jewish theology, which I don't agree with, is more similar to things that Greg would actually affirm, although there are differences there too. But nevertheless, it's not Trinitarianism, guys. Stop lying about the sources. Just represent them accurately. And the problem is these guys have to make all these different figures say exactly what they later came up with in the 4th century, whereas Greg and I don't have to do that. We can say, oh, yeah, Philo, yeah, he might have got this thing right over here, and this other thing we disagree with. So we can just read them honestly as they are. We don't have to manipulate their words into, conforming to what we actually believe.
No, that's a very good point. You guys will like it because I deal with it. Took me a long time. I collate all the texts. I check them out textually so I know they're reliable and what's not. A lot of info. It'll be a good index for you on Philo. But exactly. So we're not beholden to Philo or these early quote unquote Christian writers in the way that these other people are. So we can actually look at what they're saying and understand it in the context of thought related to the New Testament. These guys are constantly trying to position these writers to align with their later theology.
Exactly.
I could do that. I could go to Philo or Justin and say, there's all kinds of stuff here that relates to, like you were saying a minute ago, kind of how I see these things. I typically don't do that unless I'm arguing about those people, because I don't want all the other baggage that comes with their theology or Christology.
Right.
I'm not in league with them ultimately. So I just don't do it because I don't want to have to explain that whole aspect. But they do it all the time. And they're saying, well, these people all agree with us. Well, no, they don't.
Right.
They, if anything, probably agree with me more when properly understood. But ultimately, they were not on the same path.
Yeah.
So
I agree with that. That's why even my book, Greg, I make clear, like from the outset, I'm a Muslim. So obviously I probably have my own biases, but I try to use sources that these pagans would actually accept and like, from their own scholars, from their own sources, from the primary sources. I don't think I quote really any Muslims at all throughout the entire thing to make my case. I don't really quote what I would consider to be sources that are, not even sympathetic to the Trinitarian narrative. But nevertheless, I make it clear to my audience, especially Muslims who read the book, I am not saying these guys were Muslims, right? By any stretch of the imagination. I'm not saying that they agree with me. My book is just trying to prove, hey, Trinitarians, they didn't have your belief. They were not Trinitarians. And in fact, I argue that there were diversity of early Christological views. And so take your pick, but none of which are Trinitarian. So boom, that blows you guys right off the map. There were definitely modalists early on, as we're seeing. there were what I would consider people to be more similar to your view, Greg, like Justin Martyr, like Philo, and these, although not identical, but you get what I mean.
Yeah.
Subordinationist view where Jesus is elevated to a certain level, but he's not the Most High God, right? And then you have other views that, like the Ebionites or others, that would even deny a type of pre-existence. I say those are basically the three views that you have. You got the modalist view, the subordinationist view, and the kind of mere man Christology. And guess what's conspicuously missing, guys? None of those three views are actually Trinitarianism. So you guys aren't even in the game, right? Like these three groups, at least they have early predecessors who they can appeal to say, hey, there are some people who believe like I did about Christ. The Trinitarians, you don't have anything. You don't have, none of those three groups are what you guys believe, right? So that's kind of what I'm trying to prove in the book. I have a very minimal case, I feel. I'm not trying to prove that there were Muslims or even that, you know, most people held a mere man Christology that I would be more, you know, in line with. No, in fact, most of the sources I believe, most of the sources I believe actually are more in line with your view, Greg, that I would say you do have some modalists like maybe Ignatius and who else? Melito of Sardis. I explicitly say he was a modalist. Some others like that. But overall, I would say probably 70 to 80% of the tradition is more in line with your view in this kind of, you know, elevated Christ pre-existent figure, but still subordinate to the Most High God. That's kind of my analysis of the data. And nevertheless, none of the three views on the table are, you know, congruent with Trinitarianism. So you guys like Greg and I or modalists, we can have these debates amongst ourselves. What do we think is the earliest Christology? But you guys aren't even in the playing field. You're not like, you're just a water boy on the side. I mean, you're not even actually in the game. That's the way that I see it. That's kind of my view, or what I'm trying to say with the book is I don't want Muslims or other, you know, Trinitarian or even non-Trinitarian Christians to misunderstand what I'm actually arguing for in the book.
You're absolutely right. And the problem is they act like they are what they're claiming. And so it forces us to have to deal with it to such an extent that we run the risk of seeming like we're advocating for people and views that we don't actually accept.
Right.
Also that we can show the Trinitarians are lying, you know, right. Because we have to do that, or they will use what they're lying about to legitimize more lies. Mm-hmm. And so it's not just something we can ignore completely. And it's risen to such a state now where they keep throwing in our face this whole lineage of bishops and liturgy and, you know, apostolic succession, but which clearly isn't consistent across the board, nor with the best available evidence. So if we don't do something to credibly show what they're saying and these developed arguments is wrong, we're just going to run the risk of allowing more confusion to spread. So I think you're doing a great job. You've been especially honest, I know, because you're just saying what you see. It doesn't mean you agree with them, because you often don't, but you can see they're not Trinitarian. It's like with me and Ignatius. I don't agree with either view I see in him in terms of what I think the Bible teaches about God and Jesus. But I see enough to show me there's no Trinity, and that he had probably this or that view based on these texts. And then the whole tradition comes into play. So I think we have to do it. I think it is ultimately something that shouldn't have had to have been done, but that now, because of their lies and the way they've abused history and these texts, we're really left with little to no choice but to do our best to confront them.
Right, exactly. Now, Greg, I would like to go through everything, but in the interest of time, I don't want to make the video too long to where people kind of get intimidated to watch it. So quickly, are there any, like, say 1, 2, or 3 passages you think we really need to hit on before we close this out?
Okay, so we'll just kind of do a run. We'll run right down to the Syriac, and we'll finish with that because that's not much, right? So if you just where's the one
Keep
I want?
going, or
Let's we'll just go down to Smyrnans 9:1.
okay, yeah, there it is. Yeah.
Let's do this for Sam. It says it's unreasonable henceforth that we wake to soberness while we still have time to repent and turn to God. It is good to recognize God in the bishop. He that honoreth the bishop is honored of God. He that doeth aught without knowledge of the bishop, do anything without the bishop, like we read earlier, serves the devil. It uses the form of the Greek verb latruo at the end
Yeah.
there. You can see latrue. So you
Yeah.
can see right here the extent to which he is associating God with the bishop and telling people, hey, you want to serve the devil? That's exactly what Sam says, right? He calls people tools of the devil when it's usually him. So if we go down, right, Magnesian 6, that's a big one real quickly. In Magnesian 6 at the end, Jesus Christ, who was with the Father before the worlds and appeared at the end of time. Again, I've had Trinitarians tell me this proves that what I say about Jesus as the word proceeding from silence is not correct. How? That was before the worlds. So they misinterpret this. Everyone should just note that Magnesian 6:1 at the end, that is defeated by the whole word proceeding from silence if you see it as I do. And then, we went on Magnesian 7. We did that. I may have a couple of duplications here because I was going through it and copying from different documents. Let's see. If we go down to Romans, let's see, where are you on Romans opening? Calls the Father the Most High, just certain unique phrases not used often. Romans 2:2, if we keep scrolling down, he says again, sing to the Father in Jesus. Relates to the whole Pliny thing again. 3:3 talks about how it refers to our God, Jesus Christ, being in the Father, en patrion. So this to me is again part of the reason why he's able to refer to Jesus as our God, because he's the will of the Father, the mind of the Father, and he's in the Father. Effectively, the Father, my predominant view, although I don't exclude what you discussed earlier. Jesus is the unerring mouth, Romans 8:2, in whom the Father spoke. Once again, you see a temporal distinction, and you see kind of an impersonalization of Jesus in this whole modalistic view that I have of Ignatius and association with the Father. But beyond that, we can move forward. Talks about giving glory to Jesus Christ, the God who bestowed wisdom in Smyrnans 1:1, but later in that very verse refers to him as the Son of God by divine will and power. And so I see that once again as essentially saying the same things I've said earlier about how he is our God in the modalistic sense that I favor with Ignatius. Moving down, Smyrnans 1:2, it says he suffered truly, he raised himself truly, referring to Jesus, 2:1. Smyrnans 6:9 refers to the flesh of Jesus, the flesh suffered. And then it says at the end of Smyrnans 6:2, which the Father of his goodness raised up. Ha pater egerin. Now you'll find in some editions you won't see that at 6:2. You'll see it at 7:1. So you should make a note of that. I tried to note that, but it's not as clear. So just note that that's either at 6:2 or 7:1 in Smyrnans. Trailing 9:2, he talks about how in our God Jesus Christ, which relates to the other expressions that we discussed earlier about the Father. But again, he talks like this. So now if you scroll down to the first part, this is very brief. We'll end here. This is the Syriac tradition's best, most relevant text for Jesus, the Father, and the bishop. Polycarpate, right? So there's only 3 letters in this tradition. It completely contradicts the Greek Middle Recension tradition by over 50% in terms of letters and by a ton in terms of the content of the 3 letters it has. So Polycarpate, be the spirit of the times, expect him who is above the times, whom there are no times, whom who was unseen, whom for our sakes was seen. And this kind of is similar to what we read earlier from the Greek Ascension. Sam uses this a lot. He tries to use this to counter me on the whole word from silence and claim the word is eternal because it says he's above the times. Okay, first of all, it's talking about discerning the times and seasons that they're in, the very first part of the verse. And he's putting in Jesus outside of those times because he's not even a man anymore. Then he says, to whom there are no times. And again, this goes back to our whole discussion of time as it relates to a physical creation.
Exactly.
And
exactly. He harps on this, Greg, not only with, as I'm sure you'd know, not only with Ignatius But anyway, I think he does the same thing with Eusebius, with any writer, and this is something I don't know.
No, they can't. They're not going to figure it out because they misunderstand. They, first of all, they've never read Philo. I doubt it. They selectively quote from him in ways that they can abuse like this without reviewing the context, like I did in my video, where it shows he's talking about the physical time being created, and not even everything physical. In fact, he gets into the horizon of the heavens and the earth, but he puts those before the days where time begins. So it's very clear. This is during that same basic time, within like 50 years or so of Philonic Middle Platonist thought that had this developed conception of physical time, but that is not saying he's eternal. So if anything, people like Ignatius and saying things like this, or in the New Testament, when they talk about time in a biblical sense, all of Philo, even if they're Middle Platonists, they don't see being outside of time or where there are no times as eternal. So the overall language of Ignatius shows he was created, he was spoken from silence, and that he's above the physical times, that during this time, people like Philo, and even in the Bible, Genesis through Revelation, non-Middle Platonists, in my view, speak of time as a physical thing, while at the same time using words like yom or half an hour to describe events that occur sequentially in the invisible realm. So without that understanding, you're going to become like Sam, which I'm going to say is not good. And you're going to misuse a lot of text for your own selfish gain. So we can't stop him ultimately, but we can confront him like we're doing here. Polycarp 10:11. If anyone be able in strength to continue in chasing the honor of the flesh of our Lord, let him continue without boasting. Sam right there, Ignatian, Syriac tradition, gone for you. If he boasts, he is lost. It's over, right? So Sam, according to the short recension, Syriac tradition, if you boast, game over. We need an answer from you. If he become known apart from the bishop, he has corrupted himself. Okay, this is one of two explicit bishop elevations in the Syriac tradition. You saw how many, and we didn't even cover them all, and I didn't even include them all in my paper, how many there were in the Greek middle tradition, right? The best.
Yeah, there's a lot.
Here, there's just two. So there's that one, which is significant and also disqualifies Sam. And there's Polycarp 12. Look to the bishop that God may also look upon you. So again, it's not as in your face veneration as you see in the Greek middle tradition, but it's there. Ephesians opening, to the church blessed in the greatness of God the Father, chosen the purpose of truth by the will of the Father of Jesus Christ our God. So again, even in the Syriac tradition, I see this sort of, and this in the Greek text, it adds the conjunction kai here. So that says the will of the Father and Jesus Christ our God. The Syriac does not do that. The Syriac is less explicit on this being a reference to Jesus as God, and more likely a reference to the Father of Jesus as our God. So we get a confliction here with the Syriac tradition on one of the God references. And you scroll that real quick, just real briefly. And the whole will of the Father and Jesus as our God connection that I make. Ephesians 17 refers to the blood of God, but if you scroll down a little bit, because that's the only that is in there, similar with the Greek tradition. But again, this would, in my view, favor a modalistic sort of view, but could be consistent if you looked at it more representationally with, like, Jesus as God's son type of thing. Or if you don't accept Jesus as having died, you would see this as an interpolation that is not true. Ephesians 32 to 33, last one. Oh no, I'm sorry, we have a couple more. I guess the way the paper was. By those things which he speaks, he should act, and by those things which he is silent should be made known. We read this in the Greek tradition. It's also in the Syriac tradition. I wanted to point that out. Romans opening, the greatness of the Father Most High. Again, only the Father is called Most High, only a couple times in both the Greek and Syriac tradition. Romans 44:45, they may be in one accord, one in love, and may praise God the Father through Jesus Christ our Lord, because he has been accounted worthy. They're talking about Onesimus, a bishop worthy to be God's. Again, there's bishop elevation here, even saying he came from the East, right? The orthos like that. But again, the association with Jesus and the Father and the praise going to the Father here is important in this Syriac tradition. Last text, Romans 54, and it's only the last part where it calls Jesus our God. But this is what I mentioned earlier. This is not a case in the Middle Greek tradition where Jesus is called God. So the Syriac and Greek traditions differ here also on a second Jesus as our God reference, and only one of two in the Syriac tradition. So the Syriac tradition is that's it. That's all you get significant text-wise in the Syriac tradition for God, Jesus, and the bishops. People are welcome. They're not long. They're included in Curiton's publication, and you can find them online, translations. There is nothing else, right? Look at how fast that was. Like it was maybe a page and a quarter. Compare that with the 7 Middle Recension Greek letters that we didn't even close to cover in their entirety of relevant references,
Right.
So here's your Syriac. If you want to, if Sam ever brings up the Syriac tradition, all the significant readings are right here. He mostly goes to that first one and then the 2 Our God references. But you can point out to him he has times wrong there in the context of Philo in the Bible, and it's not consistent with Ignatius in terms of the word proceeding from silence, and with the way he's presented overall in the Syriac tradition, which doesn't give us much. But the times doesn't make him eternal, Sam. It just means, like Philo and in the Bible and in many other writers, he's no longer subject to the physical universe's time scale, the elements that were made in Genesis to keep track of time. He's above those times, in our view,
Right.
Ignatius, or at least the Syriac. And so there are no times that relate to him in that way in the physical sense. He's outside of them. That's the only sense you can be outside of time, right? I mean, they're still aware of the physical realm and the time it's keeping for us. So they know what day it is. They even use words like yom for when they meet, according to Job. But they're not subject to it that I can see. They're not affected by the earth becoming night or light in the time clock that we have operating. So they can come in it. They can sleep like in Genesis, when the angels visit Lot and sleep in the city square, or say they want to. They're subject to darkness and then light. So if they want to, but they actually exist in a realm that's invisible and corporeal in a way that's not Middle Platonistic in the Philonic and other later Christian Middle Platonist sense, like Justin. But because they're also using the Bible, it does have similarities that I think correspond both with the Bible and credible reality, science enough to where we can say, okay, well, they were right here, but they were wrong here when they tried to apply theories from Plato or Pythagoreanism or Stoicism to these biblical texts. So we would draw the line there and say, no, that's outside, but time-wise, yes, it's physical universe, sun, moon, and stars, and all the things in Genesis that were made keep track of time for us as a measurement, but it's not something you can't travel in time other than slow down the way it affects you. There's no infinite series of events in the past happening that you can access, or an infinitely occurring series of future events you can access. There's just now being measured by things that happened or will happen, whether thoughts or actions, depending on what scale of time or system of time you're utilizing to keep track of them, right? So God could use our scale of time for things like we see in Revelation, half an hour, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's using the exact same physical means of tracking half an hour in the invisible realm. It's just the corresponding period of time that's descriptively called half an hour for us. For them, we don't know what that is, because half an hour for us is half of an hour of a 24-hour day that's based on the sun, moon, and stars and the rotation of all these bodies in our position on the earth relative to them and each other. But for God, we don't know, right? What are in the realm of the divine, the spiritual realm where he is and the angels and other beings are, they're experiencing things that allow them to track the equivalent periods of time differently based on what they're actually experiencing, which we don't know. And oftentimes people like Sam and others act like we do know, both for time and the Trinity. They act like we have this knowledge beyond everything we've been told in ways that actually contradicts what we're told, and or is so far beyond what we're told, why are you talking about it? Right? They start to talk about and explore concepts in ways that, while it might be fun to do, kind of like what we did earlier, they do that for dogma, right? They start anathematizing people who don't agree with them conceptually when they start to develop all these things related to the Trinity, the powers, the divinity, right? It's not just them talking about verses in the Bible and speculating on what it could be. they're canonizing their views of these things in ways that are basically the same as the Bible, because without their understanding, you're not going to be able to understand the Bible. And while that might be true with respect to other religions as well, in their case, where it concerns people like me or Protestants who don't accept their authority, or what we see in Ignatius fully developed like that or interpolated, it creates a lot of problems, because we're pointing to the things we're all supposed to be sharing as an authority, whereas they're pointing to those only if they agree with them, and then at the same time changing their meaning in ways that agree with what they believe that's not in them. And so then we end up arguing for what they think or interpret what is written to mean, when we all know that's not what they mean, and they don't really care what's written if it's not what they mean. Yeah. I would ultimately, it's a waste of time, but it's not, because we have to do it or a lot of things could be lost. It's a waste of time in the original sense that this never should have happened, but we can't cry over spilled milk because that won't clean it up, We have to deal with what is now, and I appreciate everything you do. I think we do have a lot of agreement. We could cultivate that, or just be on good terms with people to the extent possible. Where we don't agree, we can state that in an agreeable manner, where we don't have pre-existing problems with lunatics and others who do unusual things that compromise people's reputations, way of life, family, blaspheme their religion, right? Once you do that, I think, the goal has been lost in large part. And with Sam and others, it has. But we've lost the objective, but we're trying to wade our way through what they've created and still salvage something worth saving, right? People's faith and their belief in things that are pure and good. The ones that want to follow Sam and all this insanity, there's not much we can really do for them.
Yeah, exactly. I do want to show this really quickly before we end. So just to show people, this is not just Ignatius, right? So Sam, he's got his little blog. I don't know why. I guess he's a boomer that he can't keep one website down. He keeps changing the URL all the time. But anyway, this is his newest one. This is posted, you can see here, just 3 days ago. Eusebius on the Trinity, part 1. He's got 3 parts on Eusebius on the Trinity. I just want to read this, and I just want to give you guys a taste of my book where I blow this loser out of the water. You just see how dishonest this guy is. So look, he says here, in this series of posts, I will be quoting from Against Marcellus and on Ecclesiastical Theology, Fathers of the Church Patristic Series, translated by Kelly McCarthy Sporrell and Marcus Vincent, and published by the Catholic University of America Press in 2017. I'll show you why I'm reading all of this in just a second. It is the refutation of Eusebius of Caesarea against the heretic Marcellus. Even though, for people who know church history, Marcellus and Athanasius were kind of buddies at certain times throughout the 4th century. So it's interesting he's ready to call him a heretic. And then he says, the aiming of citing this work is to show that Eusebius was a Trinitarian who affirmed that the Son and the Holy Spirit are uncreated divine hypostases persons. Listen, the Son and the Holy Spirit are uncreated persons. There have been those who have either misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented Eusebius's statements as implying that he was a semi-Arian, which is the furthest thing away from the truth. As a careful examination of this specific work demonstrates, the context of Eusebius's refutation was Marcellus's claims that God's word was not a distinct person hypostasis with God, but rather was identical to God and only became rational when it took on human flesh and became the man Jesus. Marcellus thought the word was eternal in the sense of it being one and the same as God the Father. Marcellus also believed that the word would return to its former state after the end of the age, when the Son would subject himself to God. This is why Eusebius repeatedly charged Marcellus of being a follower of Sibelius, or basically modalism, an early heretic who taught that Jesus is the human incarnation of the Father himself. It was in respect of these teachings that Eusebius rejected that the Son was eternal, not because he thought that he was a creature, but because of the way Marcellus understood it. Marcellus understood this term to deny any personal differentiation between God and his word, which is the reason why Eusebius took issue with it. Eusebius affirmed the monarchy of the Father, which meant that the Father alone is unbegotten and is the source without source. Eusebius argued that in order for the Son to be truly distinct from the Father, he had to be begotten. Otherwise, there would be no real differentiation between them. The same logic applies to the Spirit, who must have been spirated by the Father. Who must have been spirated by the Father. Will show that that is a lie from the pit of hell, in order for him to be truly different and distinct from both the Father and the Son. That Eusebius believed that the Son and the Spirit were not creatures that God brought into being or produced from things created, can easily be demonstrated by what he writes throughout his response. I give a few examples here to illustrate. And then he goes on, and it's just a quote mine, misrepresentation of Eusebius in certain parts. And he's got 3 parts, 2 more articles of this. I just wanted to show you the introduction. The reason why is one of the texts he's quoting there, which is a translation, I think, from Catholic University Press. Let me see if I could share my screen here and give you guys a sneak preview of something I have in my book. Okay. All right, let's see. All right, are you guys able to see this? Is that coming through on the screen, Greg?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is, and God is my witness, I kid you not. I wrote this section, this chapter on Eusebius before Sam posted that, because he only posted it 3 days ago, right? So watch this. I actually, because I want to give the Trinitarians as much ground as I can and then just roast them. Because one thing that they lie on, because people know, as you would know, Greg, Eusebius actually argued on the part of the Arians initially at the Council of Nicaea. But then he wound up actually signing the creed. And so what they say is, yeah, he was initially had, deviant or heretical views, but then he came on the side of Athanasius later on when he signed the creed and going forward. So one way to refute that is to look at his writings post-Nicaea. And his 2 latest works that he ever wrote were on against Marcellus and on ecclesiastical theology, both of which Sam is claiming represent Trinitarian belief. So I'm going to show you. I don't go through, because it would be too easy to go to the works from Eusebius pre-Nicaea, right? I only focused on post-Nicene text. So this is what he says on ecclesiastical theology from the translation that Sam was citing, okay? Which is this. This is verbatim what he says. This is a direct quote. I'm making it big here, so Fat Boy can't run now from the same text that he's citing here. Since the Son, this is Eusebius now, this one passage buries in his entire 3-part series. Just throw it down the toilet. Since the Son has been honored with the paternal divinity, he would be the maker and fashioner of all created things, both visible and invisible, and surely also of the very existence of the counseling Spirit. Mm-hmm. What does that say, Greg? He is the creator and fashioner of all things visible and invisible, including the very existence of the counseling Spirit. You're done right there, dude. No Trinitarianism. The Spirit is created by the Son, you lying devil. And then he continues, what is his evidence? He quotes New Testament for support of this. For all things were made, what? Through him, and without not one thing was made. And in him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. So he uses those New Testament passages to say that the Spirit, not as Sam lied, is spirated by the Father. Not only is he created, he's not created by the Father, he's created by the Son directly, because all things were created through him. Then he continues, but the God, Hatheos, the God who is beyond all things and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, being something ineffably good and greater than any calculation and conception, any speech and consideration of all things, however many or whatever type they may happen to be, leading his Holy Spirit besides the only begotten Son, rightly has alone been declared the God who is over all and through all and in all, by the apostle when he says, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of us all, who is over all and through all and in all. And he alone would be called one God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. So what does that sound like? You have one God who is the God, the Father alone, who is ineffably good and greater than any calculation, all of the attributions that he's ascribing to the Father. That's the Father. He already told you that the Spirit was created by the Son, but now he's going to say, just in case people, masturbate too much and they can't really focus for more than 5 seconds, fat boy, he's going to remind you again that the Holy Spirit is created by the Son, just in case you were confused the first time. He says, and he alone would be called one God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, while the Son would be the only begotten God who is in the bosom of the Father. So you have two things. You have God the Father, who is Hatheos uniquely. Then you have the only begotten God, who is the Son. And then what does he say about the Spirit? But the counseling Spirit would be neither God nor Son, since he himself has not also received his generation from the Father as the Son has. So remember when Fat Boy said in his article that the Spirit was spirated by the Father, he explicitly, Eusebius, denies this. He says you have God, then God's Son, and then the Spirit who's created by God's Son, right? He says here, watch. But the counseling Spirit would be neither God nor Son, since he himself has not also received his generation from the Father as the Son has, but is one of those things brought into existence through the Son, because all things were made through him, and without him not one thing was made. You are busted, Sammy. This is a translation of the ecclesiastical theology passage text and translation which you cited, and to show you that I am not just a delusional Muslim, or as he likes to call Greggy, a delusional Arian, or no. I'm going to show you. Yeah, exactly. I'm going to show you that the same translation here, the text actually interprets it the exact same way. Look at this.
Oh, so instruction all over here.
Yeah, watch this. I say here, for Eusebius, the Son is the creator of the Holy Spirit. Notice also the difference between the Father and the Son. The Father is the God who is beyond all things, ineffable and incapable of being described justly. The Son is the only begotten God. The Holy Spirit is brought into existence by the Son. Once again, Sporl and Vincent comment saying, remember the two that Sammy Boy was relying on for his translation. What do they say about this exact passage? In ET, which refers to Ecclesiastical Theology 3, he, meaning Eusebius, explicitly claims that the Spirit is created by the Son, and as such is subordinate to him. The Father had to create human nature first, and the Son had to prepare it before the Spirit was received by it. The assertion of the Spirit's created status is another legacy from Origen, who also, as in an earlier chapter on Origen, I show that Origen says that the Spirit was created by the Son. Bam, fat boy, you are buried on a silver platter. There's nothing for you to go to, because your own source and own translation, which I used even before, this is, I'm not claiming like Ignatius to be divinely inspired, but God has a way of,
this is good. I feel special. I feel like we're getting a preview of like
this is a preview of a smackdown on the fat boy.
Thank you.
Who keeps running his mouth, because this one passage shows the hierarchy. You have the one God the Father, you have the only begotten God the Son, and then you have the Holy Spirit, who is created by the Son. So when Fat Boy said that according to Eusebius, that both the Son and the Spirit are uncreated hypostases, and that the Spirit is spirated by the Father, he explicitly denies this. He says he's neither God nor Son, because why? The Spirit is not generated from the Father. He is actually created by the Son, and his own, to show, look, I could just say, look, it's obvious based upon the text. I don't need to give you an interpretation. I give you a commentary of the exact passage I used to bury you from your own translation, which comments on it and says, yes, Eusebius believes the Spirit is created by the Son, and this is because he was following an earlier position of origin, which we know that Eusebius was in that milieu. So, and then I don't just stop there, I give other passages, but that alone busts you down, fat boy, and this was written long before you even wrote those articles. Now, Greg, if Fat Boy sees this, or any of his fans do, or they happen to read my chapter on Eusebius from the book, how could you possibly interpret Eusebius in any other way than that the Spirit is created by the Son? And his own sources that he appeals to admit this. And these are Christian commentaries.
The weirdest thing happened while you were finishing up reading that. I had a vision of Sam that is almost never seen, and that's him pre-bloat. But then right when you finished, he bloated, kind of like the way a giant puffer fish just explodes, Now, whether that really happened or not, we'll have to check the live. He's probably doing a competing live, or we'll see later. He's usually bloated, but that's why it's so unusual. While you were reading that, he was in a pre-bloat. It was like he was focused. But then once you made the point crystal clear, he bloated. So I don't know if that's what does it. Something happens where he's like seeing it, and then darkness takes over, and he's blind as a perverted bat, like I like to say. I think Sam has a genuine dishonesty streak in him. I think, there are times when I think I see something normal, but it's so far gone at this point, and he has cemented his insanity with so many layers of blasphemy. I think he's genuinely, delusionally only trying to deceive people. Like, at this point, his reason for living is to keep people believing lies. So nothing will matter. What you just read, as you said, is as clear as it could probably have been made. He won't see it, right? So it reminds me of Isaiah 6, 52, 53, and John 12, the parts that show that God blinds people, right? There are some people, whether you believe this or not, we could show them.
I believe 100%. The Quran says the same thing.
And we it's hard to believe that about someone, because you're essentially giving up on them at that point. But you could see what Jesus had to deal with if you accept that account. Yet at some point, they just are not worth the time. Other people are, and so they become the object of trying to help other people. But it's unfortunate that especially people like Sam have been given the mantle for so long to run with as this champion of the God of the Bible, when he's the 100% opposite of that, and in no way even close to being considered deserving of that. They should have seen this a long time ago on the Protestant side, but they were so infatuated with his ability to help them with Muslims and with non-Trinitarians, they just couldn't do it. Their insecurities over their own inability to deal with those people or us made them ignore all of the obvious signs that should have told you, don't go here. They ignored it all and did it for their own selfish gain and to be viewed as something they're not in association with someone who's crazy. Now they've made him think that he is that, and he is good in some ways that have to be acknowledged, but it's so far gone and so dishonorable that we have to deal with such a person in order to champion our belief systems. They are to blame, Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox, because every single one of them, especially the Protestants, embraced him in large part, even though some may have rejected him, until he turned on them. And yet they get mad at people like me or others who use language that rises really as frequently as bad as he is. And they invented him. They promoted him, and only when he turned on them. It's not like they reached a point.
David Wood. Now they're all fighting, but yet he was with him for years, decades.
Yeah, I knew he was a woman abuser.
Exactly. He knew, Greg, he knew, according to what he said, and we don't know if this, whether it's true or not, this actually shows more about David Wood. According to David Wood, he knew for decades that Sam's ex-wife told his wife that she raped him before they got married. And yet he didn't say anything to anybody, still maintained a friendship with him. And this was while he was supposedly a Christian man, raped his ex-wife before they got married. And you think you're exposing Sam? You are, but you're also exposing yourself because you did nothing and you sat idly like a little boy right behind Sam trying to follow along with him. Yet you thought that he raped his ex-wife? I mean, it's just crazy.
It really is. And, so there's a lot going there. Now, it's not going to change, though. Sam is not necessarily going to go away. He's too insecure and he's an egomaniac. And those things are significant. To me, though, setting the really egregious things he's done aside and the way people brush them under the rug for the sake of their false doctrine, the fact is he's not a good person in almost every way. And yet they promoted him as someone you can learn accurately about God from. Go to Sam, like all these young, in terms of their beliefs and things and morals, they're sending them to Sam for decades to be spiritually educated. And to me, I don't know how they can recover from that, right? We all have problems. We all we're part of groups that have things like that. But this is kind of ongoing, right? Because Sam's ongoing. They haven't stopped what they started in him. And the only reaction and rejection is after he disagreed with them. So this was not a truth or moral-based rejection of Sam ultimately. They used him and would still probably accept him and use him if he just agreed with them, So the state of apologetics today is pretty wild. They're all trying to create this fantasy of never having really been involved with Sam. And so it's a big problem. But I think if we can just try to focus on the issues, Sam won't necessarily let that happen. But to the extent that we can, I try to give him some of his own where I can. And that helps because it affects him. And Sam is a force and he's regular. And if you don't affect him, he's probably going to affect you or someone else. Either way, I think if we just try to be as respectful but truthful as we can, meaning he's a pig-faced fatso and a blimp. Not that, people don't have weight issues. He's a glutton. He's what the Old New Testament speak against in terms of people who do things that are not appropriate in order to satisfy the God that is their belly. It's an excessive dependence on physical things that drives him to act in these crazy ways and yet still allow him to be a voice in spiritual circles. So it's an odd phenomenon. He is knowledgeable in many ways that should be considered serious because he's affecting people. But his knowledge, even though it's broad, it's very shallow most of the time. So once you crack a layer or two, he's done. And most people just don't know that. And so he keeps doing damage, right? He's really good at that surface level damage. Sam isn't as good with deeper thinkers, although there aren't many on their side. Is so filled with paganism, it wouldn't take much. But the surface level people that get kind of drawn to Sam, he's really good at somehow he's able to captivate them. And even though he's openly very unusual and not appealing, I don't know, he's whatever it is, he's mastered his skill at convincing. He knows their weak points, right? He's seen enough of these pagan Christians to know what they're looking for, so he gives it to them.
Well, he's a master debater. You know, we know that he's a masturbator, so it transitions pretty nicely. You know, he's got a few talents.
Even those things don't tend to knock him off, right? He's become this unusual spectacle of insanity.
It's crazy, Greg. It's like if you wanted to actually make fun of him worse than he already does of himself, you couldn't, because he already does it.
That's what's so unusual too, right? You think he'd be a little more guarded. He's not. He's like the very things he is, he'll lead with those on you. Right? That's weird. Yeah. So he's got this unusual psychology that insulates him from it affects him, but it ultimately allows him to recycle it and start again. He's a very unique character. I don't mean it in a good way, but anything that's a spectacle, I think, catches your attention. He's not to be fully underestimated, though. I don't want to make it seem like he's a full joke. He's just made himself into a joke over things that are serious, to the point where we have to take him both serious and not serious, right? This is the whole dual, it's a whole contradictory. He's a living contradiction, right? So it's no surprise his theology is the same.
Yeah, this is something I just wanted to read quickly as well. It's also in my Eusebius section, and this is for Fat Boy because his patron saint, you know, the Catholics have this idea of patron saints and all this.
Jerome.
His patron saint is Jerome, and he lets you know this all the time about, I'm so tough with people because I'm like the patron saint Jerome. Okay, let's see what your patron saint Jerome says about Eusebius. Now, Greg, I went into a lot of detail on Eusebius. It's one of the chapters I'm actually most proud of in my book, if I can say. I show not just through Jerome, through Athanasius, I show through Acts of the Seventh Ecumenical Council explicitly calling Eusebius and anathematizing him in his own ecumenical councils. And yet Fat Boy and yet Fat Boy is going against Ignatius and what he's saying about following the bishops and following the church and all this. His own ecumenical councils actually anathematize Eusebius. So I'm trying to bring texts out that are not as public and popularize them against these kind of losers like Sam. But I really focus on Jerome because I had him in mind. I know that he's his patron saint, so maybe he can pray to him after he sees this and confirm that what I'm saying is correct. I'm just going to read one passage, but I cite about 4 or 5 just to show I'm not cherry picking of Jerome calling Eusebius an Arian. So in this section right here, this small quote here, this is Jerome speaking. So this is well after Nicaea. This is well after Eusebius already died. He says, in the same way, he played fast and loose with the name of the holy martyr Pamphilus, ascribing to him the first of the 6 books in defense of Origen, written by Eusebius of Caesarea, who is admitted by everybody to have been an Arian. So Jerome is not only saying that Eusebius was an Arian, he's saying everybody admits at his time, in the second half of the 4th century, everybody admits that Eusebius was an Arian. So what are you talking about, Fat Boy? Remember if we go back to his article here, look, let's go back to his article, what he said in the beginning part. He said what? Here. The aim of citing this work is to show that Eusebius was a Trinitarian who affirmed that the Son and Holy Spirit are uncreated persons. We already destroyed that. There have been those who have either misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented Eusebius' statements as implying that he was a semi-Arian, which is the furthest thing away from the truth, as a careful examination of this specific work demonstrates. So Fat Boy, yeah. So Fat Boy, why are you praying like a pagan? Why are you praying to your patron Saint Jerome, who you're saying is misrepresenting Eusebius? He says everybody knows that he's an Arian. Wow. So you are busted, brother. You are completely busted.
Oh,
there's nothing left for you now.
What you just read, and yet he still will struggle. He'll somehow convince himself in some way. It's where people have to be independent, right? You get influenced by Sam just by his insanity and trying to ruminate over these obvious death blows to his doctrine, right? But he's kind of like Jerome in one sense. They're terrified of being considered not orthodox or false doctrine, right? Even though for Sam it's probably nowhere near Jerome's level of yeah, well, it depends, right? We don't know these people very well, but they both act in ways that are similar in that respect. Instead of doing what was right, either with respect to Origen or Eusebius, or with Sam doing what's right with respect to people today, all they care about is reading Dragon Church theology into every text and argument they can to contradict non-Trinitarian beliefs about God.
But hey, at least Jerome was a little bit more honest, because he's just admitting Eusebius and Origen were Arian heretics. He openly says this.
Well, Sam's, beyond liar than that.
Sam won't even do that.
He would if he was trying to condemn someone, right? But again, because he's trying to use it, he doesn't want to give up those people. He wants a bigger tradition than he really has, hence Ignatius. But for people like Jerome, right, they're dealing with the real world realities of, well, I mean, I would say even Jerome, right? The way he seemed to have surprisingly condemned Origen. But, when you're in these positions and people are accusing you of things like Epiphanius and Theodoric. You have all these.
Epiphanius condemned Origen too.
Right? So same with Sam. You got people that get up here on videos or elsewhere and they start calling you a heretic. That's what happened back in these days with more significant people in the structure that caused these reactions to people that when you read apart from them, you think, well, this probably was a good Christian guy on some levels. No, they are very capable and were susceptible to very bad treatment of other Christians and doctrines in favor of less likely true traditions that they preferred, and the positions that they had achieved and the associations that they had developed with other people making these accusations. So compromising is very much a part of the Dragon Church, right? Either you don't and you're in, or you do and you got to watch your back, right? It's only a matter of time before people start whispering, very much like certain, again, modern cults, but people tend to think that's only in cults. Maybe, but these big mainstream religions all started out that way by condemning other people who were teaching things they didn't agree with and taking over the structures of power that allowed them to define doctrine and to eliminate doctrine, including whole texts containing multiple usable versions of accepted texts from the Old Testament. So it wasn't even doctrinal in that respect, unless you're going to identify certain parts of those texts. Either way, look at the extent to which they went to protect their traditions and destroy other people's. This isn't a passive approach by them. It is very active and has been since the beginning, even in the New Testament, I would say. And we see the manifestations of this kind of personality in Ignatius and all the way through to Nicaea and beyond. So it's important we do this.
Yeah, 100%. So, I just wanted to bust him down a little bit before we ended there, give him a little sneak preview to my book. I hope Sam will buy the book and try to deal with it, but I highly doubt that he'll be able to, because he'll probably be, I don't know, tossing and turning at night once he reads that section on Eusebius and a bunch of other stuff I got in there, surprises for him.
Well, we'll never know if he reads it, but one thing he'll do, he'll get someone else to buy it and tell him what they think it says, and then he'll take that, change it like he does with Eusebius and others, and then he'll do multiple part live streams responding to your book we never read that someone else told him about and that he reinterpreted for the live.
Exactly. So before we go, once again, just want to get it right. Your YouTube channel is CJW JaTube, right? Is that it?
That's a little confusing. I know. I'll probably change it maybe at some point just to my name, but right now it's CW, right? Because the people that think like I do, we're called Christian Witnesses of Jah, right? So we have a lot of similar theology with Watchtower in the Bible, but we don't have all the prophetic stuff I talked about earlier, and we're pretty straightforward and simple. So either way, it's CW Jah, JAH Tube. CW Jah Tube.
Right, and I'll put it in the description, guys, for people who watch this later. I'll put a link to that in the description. And then the website is the same thing.org. Is that it?
Yeah, cwjah.org. It's a lot of resources for stuff like this, and I'll continue to update it, and I'll give you a basic intro into what we do and how we're different from these other guys. But I really appreciate you having me on, Jake. I thank you for the opportunity to go over this issue, discuss Ignatius, and I think we're on the same page in terms of overall how to approach him and his teachings in his text, and then the importance of countering those who are misusing him. So thank you very much.
Exactly. No, and I thank you for coming on and putting the document together. Again, if people want that, you can reach out to Greg by email, or I may try to find a way to upload it and then put it in the description of the video to where people could download it if they want. Only last thing is, Greg, we'll probably do another stream at some point. People don't know, I've just been so busy working on my book, but I'm finally done with it. So I contacted Greg and I said, oh, let's do a stream since, Sam keeps talking about us, but we'll wait and see. We'll wait and see the reaction to see if he's going to engage with any of the material, or at least claim to attempt to. And then if he does, we have no problem addressing it again. I have no problem having Greg on again to address any of these kind of things, or maybe dealing with somebody else. If maybe he tries to come up back and lie on Eusebius, we'll deal with that too. And we'll keep at it. Like I said, I don't disrespect all Christians, especially I don't even disrespect all Trinitarians. But when you have somebody like Sam, he's a different animal, so to speak, and he has to be dealt with in a different way. So it is what it is. I hope that, most of his followers are probably brainwashed by now, but maybe some of them will see stuff like this, and, maybe it'll start to get them to think for themselves and think maybe we should stop thinking like this Ignatius in terms of Sam being the bishop that we just need to blindly submit to and follow as if he's God in the flesh, God forbid. And think
and in lust, so he shouldn't even be reading Ignatius.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, we'll end it there. Greg, I want to thank you again for joining. People, check out some of the stuff he has going on. I'm really interested. I know it's a few months out, at least maybe the end of the year, this book on Philo. It's very important because Sam and these Trinitarians totally misuse Philo as well, and a lot of his material and the two powers in heaven stuff. So be on the lookout for that. I'm really interested in that. I think it'll be a unique contribution to the field. So that will be good when that comes out. Somebody asked about my book earlier. This guy here. You can't get my book yet because I haven't published it. Right now it's in the editing process and having it typeset and all that. So once that gets done over the next week or two, I'm planning on creating a website for it, and then you can just go on there and you'll be able to order it there. So if you follow me on social media, when it's ready and when it comes out, I will post it on my YouTube, community page and stuff like that. So just be on the lookout for that over the next couple weeks, God willing. But anyway, thanks again, everybody, for watching and tuning in. I think that it was respectful for the most part in the chat there. So thanks for that. And I will see you all again next time. Take care. Okay, let's end the stream.